Thank you. Welcome and good evening. This is the regular meeting of the Morro Bay City Council. It is Tuesday, May 12th, 2020. It is 5:30 p.m. and this meeting is being held via teleconference. Madam Clerk, do we have a quorum of council members present?
Yes, Mayor Heading, all but Councilmember Addis are present at the moment. I anticipate she'll be joining any moment.
Great, thank you. With that, we do have a quorum, and I will ask for a moment of silence, please. Thank you. And if you will all join me and stand, we will have the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance, to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. With that, Mr. City Attorney, do we have a closed session report this evening? Mr. Niermeyer, is our City Attorney on board? Okay.
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. I will ask for that report in just a moment. I'll move to Mayor, council members' reports. I'll start with a notice that the Morro Bay City Council will have a special meeting this coming Thursday, May the 14th at 2 p.m. The special meeting will be to discuss COVID-19 related issues, and you are all invited to attend that. Tune in. We will be giving updates with regard to COVID-19 and taking community input with regard to some of the issues of concern a number of you have expressed to us as council members. I did want to give you a very brief update this evening on COVID-19 for San Luis Obispo County as of 5/11/2020 at 1600 hours. The San Luis Obispo County had 226 confirmed positive cases of COVID-19. On 5/4, approximately 1 week ago, we had approximately 192 cases. We have at present 1 death, and on 5/4 had 1 death at that time. The county has significantly increased its testing capacity. On 5/4, they had performed 1,600 tests, and at present, as of 5/11, they're up to 2,180 and are establishing additional test sites as we speak to increase the number of individuals that are tested in all communities. The ages for the majority of cases are between 18 and 64, as they have been almost during the full tenure of this outbreak. However, we've had a fairly significant increase in the age group of 0 to 17. We had 14 cases on 5/4, and we now have 21 cases as of yesterday in that age group. By region, North County has the majority of cases, 137, up from 118 on 5/4. Paso Robles has the majority of those with 86 cases, 68 cases, again, approximately 1 week ago. The central region has 30 cases, up by 1 from 29 1 week ago. The coastal region has had 12 cases, up by, again, 1 from a week ago. Morro Bay had remained fairly consistent over the last few weeks at 6 cases. We are up by 1. We now have 7 cases in Morro Bay. And in the South County, there are 47 cases, up from 44 cases one week ago. The mode of transmission is primarily with regard to over 80% of the cases in the person-to-person or community transmission mode. That is from individual to individual. Travel remains the same as it was several weeks ago. Nearby counties continue to exceed San Luis Obispo County. Monterey County now has 279 cases with 6 deaths. Kern County, 1,286 with 15 deaths. Santa Barbara County, including Lompoc FCI inmate and staff counts, which is a significant proportion of the cases there, has 1,308 cases with 11 deaths. Fresno County, surrounding counties, 945 with 9 deaths. Tulare County, 1,159 cases with 50 deaths. Fully 172 patients out of the 226 have recovered from COVID-19 in our county. The remainder, majority, are at home recuperating and recovering. We at present have 4 hospitalized patients in the county, 2 in the ICU, and as I mentioned previously, fortunately, only 1 death. The last point I wanted to make before the special meeting, where we'll go into much more detail next Thursday, San Luis Obispo County had created their own START guideline to begin the process of recovery from COVID-19. The governor has decided not to sanction individual county plans and has developed a very specific, detailed criteria assessment protocol that must be filled out by each county, which our county health officer has filled out and submitted. We are waiting to hear if the governor will allow us to move forward into the state's phase 2. The point that I'm making is we will not be implementing in San Luis Obispo County the plan that we previously had discussed at the last meeting, and that is available on readyslow.org. We will remain under the state's resilience roadmap. And if you want further information with regard to that, you can go to covid19.ca.gov and get all the information about the governor's plan. I will tell you that the shelter-in-place order remains. We know that as a community, we are experiencing an influx of individuals from out of town, and we will be discussing that in detail at Thursday's special meeting at 2 p.m. With that, I'll turn it over to other council members. Councilmember Addis, any comments or information reports?
No major reports, but I do want to thank staff and all of the departments for their work during COVID. I know they received a lot of questions and complaints and reports from the public that they've been fielding, and I know they're receiving the same from council and from me. So I just want to say thank you, and I want to say to the public that it is my belief that staff is working hard, and I'm glad to see we'll have a special meeting on Thursday where more of what we're doing can be shared and more input can be gathered from the community. So thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Councilmember Davis.
Yes, I want to recognize tonight 2 of our special moral-based citizens, Marty and Ronnie Lamelli, for the valuable ways that they are contributing to our community. Marty volunteered to act as our city manager during our search for a replacement for our former city manager. And after we hired Scott, Marty trained him and he continues to mentor him. Marty also is serving on numerous special city committees like the Harbor Lease Management Policy, interview panels, advisor to MBOSA, many more. And Ronnie is running the VOAD program with Marty's help for the city's volunteer system to match people who need help with people who are volunteering to help them. So I want to thank Ronnie and Marty both for the great support they're giving to our community. And then I want to mention that I sent letters last week to our legislators, Jordan Cunningham, Salud Carbajal, Belmonting, Senators Harris and Feinstein, reminding them that California cities and counties are the frontline warriors in this battle that we're waging against COVID. We are spending down our reserves. Our revenues have almost disappeared. We're deferring TOT, lease payments, sales tax. CalPERS is going to need additional payments to compensate for their losses. And so far, no one in Sacramento or Washington is supporting local governments. And without support from state and federal governments, California cities are just going to run out of money. I've received one response to my letters from legislative aide Taylor Melody, who wrote that Assemblyman Cunningham agrees with your position and recently joined numerous other colleagues in the state legislature calling on Governor Newsom to make sure that the Corona Relief Fund created by the CARES Act gets equally distributed amongst all California cities, not just Los Angeles and San Francisco. So we do have the attention of folks in Sacramento, and Mayor Heading, I know you received a similar response from Senator Feinstein. So I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that we will get some relief to help cities and counties. Thank you.
Thank you for that report. And yes, I will affirm that I received a letter from Senator Feinstein personally responding to the information that I sent. Also to the same group of other legislators that you also sent letters to. But her acknowledgement was that she was very supportive of a round of funding for localities and those that are suffering, like the city of Morro Bay, and that she would be very much in favor of moving that forward. Thank you for that. Councilmember Heller.
Yes, I'd like to welcome everyone who's listening in this evening. And just as a friendly reminder, I hope you're all safe and doing what you need to do in these stressful times to take care of yourself and your family and your friends. And I appreciate you taking the time to tune in tonight. I'm very encouraged that Mr. Mayor Heading has the staff has scheduled this meeting for Thursday at 2 p.m. The good news is we're scheduling a meeting to answer as many of your questions as we can. The not so great news is the Zoom meeting, and it's a special meeting, so we're only taking public comment at the very beginning of the meeting. However, I encourage you to email or text or send your questions or concerns between now and Tuesday at 2 o'clock. You can send them to council@morrobayca.gov, or you can mail it, snail mail it. You can text your favorite council person. We really want to try and answer your questions. There's so much going on out there, and it's shifting sands, and I understand your concerns, and we will do the best we can Thursday afternoon to answer them. I'd like to thank city staff for all the work that they've been doing. Difficult work, out of the sight of the public for the most part, but you are carrying a heavy load and doing an outstanding job. Police and fire doing a remarkable job. We have new conditions on weekends that maybe were not anticipated. There are a lot of things going on we never could have anticipated, and I think everybody's doing an outstanding job of dealing with this challenge. And for those of you who are Facebook people, I'm going to plug my Facebook page again because it took me about 3 weeks to get it up and running. Jeff Heller, City Council. Please look at it, like me, and follow me. Thank you.
I always like that Facebook plug. And thank you for asking people to email us prior to Thursday's meeting and provide input and or ask questions. Councilmember McPherson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and welcome everyone. I actually have no announcements, but I would like to echo the comments of all of my fellow council members in terms of thanking the staff and also the council members who have been very proactive in reaching out and trying to get us some aid. So, and I appreciate the special meeting we're going to have. So thanks to everybody in the community for stepping up and caring, and we're rock solid together. So thank you.
Great, and thank you for that. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Collins, City Manager report. Mr. Collins.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members and members of the community. Just a couple of things. One update on, I think Councilmember Davis had mentioned that we're seeking, and the mayor, all council members really pushing hard to seek federal or state assistance. Just learned that earlier this afternoon, the House, I think, is either passed or primed to pass a new spending bill called the HEROES Act, which would bring direct revenues to local governments. Significant amount of funding. However, it's built in with a bunch of other things, and I think the total price tag is in the $3 to $4 trillion range. It has been immediately called out by the Senate and the President. However, there is hope that there will be discussion probably in June when the Senate will introduce its own similar bill, and then there would be some compromise like we saw in the first CARES Act. So there seems to be some understanding, or at least in one of the chambers, about the need for local governments to, because we've been on the front lines addressing this. That us and hospitals and other sectors have been on the front lines. So just wanted to make sure that was up in the discussion. And then lastly, as the mayor discussed, I mean, we are in a sort of a global pandemic, and there's the public health side, but there's also been significant economic damage done to our local business community and significant financial damage done to the city as a result of all the shelter at home orders and the stoppages that have helped preserve our public health. And given the unprecedented time that we're in with the pandemic and the related financial fallout for the city, I've convened an ad hoc group of community leaders to assist me in developing recommendations for our city council in our recovery efforts and our relief and recovery efforts, spending the course of this month to bring forward some ideas and recommendations for both the short-term and sort of long-term fiscal recovery. So I wanted to announce that tonight and let you know that I have a good group of members of our community, including Homer Alexander, Walter Heath, Marie Hay, John Solu, Jen Ford, Jeff Eccles, and Susan Stewart, who have pretty broad representation and understanding of our business community, but also our general public needs, and also have understanding of the city and how our finances work. So sort of have a leg up and moving quickly to look at what we've already done, but also come up with other measures, potentially recommendations to assist the city in our efforts. And I really want to thank them for volunteering to support our city. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for that update. And I will ask if our city attorney is present and if there's a closed session report.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. There's no reportable action from closed session.
Thank you, Chris. Very much appreciated. With that, I will move to general public comment. This is public comment for items that are either on the agenda for which you cannot call in later, or for items that are not on the agenda that you wish to speak to. Members of the public may watch the meeting and speak during general public comment or on a specific agenda item by logging into the Zoom webinar, and you see that login on the screen there, hopefully, and using the public information provided, as I said on the screen. Please use the raise hand feature to indicate your desire to provide public comment. And as always, each speaker will be allowed 3 minutes to provide input. And thank you, Dana, for having that on the screen and available to the public. With that, Zeke, do we have anybody on the call for public comment, please?
Yes, sir. We have a number of people in the queue. 2 people have raised their hands.
Okay.
There are people on dial-up phones that if they push *9, their hands will be raised. All right.
Thank you for that. Why don't we start with our first caller?
Okay. Okay, first caller. John Weiss.
Hi, good evening, Mayor, Council, City staffers, and citizens. John Weiss, resident, business owner for over 40 years and homeowner for over 30 years. I'm heartened that our city manager has recently formed a committee to look at options to cut the budget deficit. I welcome hearing about their input and hope it results in a balanced budget without dipping into reserves. Looking at our city history, there was a pre-COVID 2019-2020 budget, which should be noted, predicted a shortfall of $900,000, with the gap being filled with reserves and transfers to balance the budget. Thus, this suggested we are going to run out of money in 2 to 3 fiscal years based on a pre-COVID city 10-year forecast. In a very recent issue of the Estero Bay News, according to Neil Farrow, who I've known for over 25 years, he wrote an article about the current dire finances of the city. It also stated that several very appreciated steps to start to close the deficit budget gap, but it is obviously are not enough, and bold discussions and steps are needed. I ask our citizens to read the May 7th article by Neil Farrell, please. I love Morro Bay, and I don't wish to embarrass anyone. I know we are in this together, and our challenge is tough. I do believe there are answers. My hope is that our council will address these unanswered budget questions regarding the staggering deficit with viable solutions. I hope this vital topic is addressed immediately. Please have a good meeting. All my best. John Weiss.
Thank you, John. Be safe and be well. Zeke, our next public comment, please.
Yes, sir. Betty Winholtz.
Welcome, Betty.
You have to unmute yourself. Betty, you have to unmute yourself. No, she can only do it.
See it? Is that better?
Much
Betty,
better.
yes, we can hear you, Betty. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I didn't understand that. I'd like to touch on 3 topics pretty quickly. The first one has to do with the letters that I sent to you and the Morro Bay Community Power organization that now has our electrical power for the city of Morro Bay. And I'll just read my comment. Last year, Morro Bay residents were notified that Monterey Bay Community Power would be our carrier of electricity as voted by the City Council previously. They did this to reduce prices for us and to be environmentally friendly. Last month, the Monterey Bay Community Power Policy Board, of which the mayor is an alternate, voted to accept the nuclear power as one of its sources for green energy. Last week, the California Public Utilities Commission voted to allow this Monterey group to include the nuclear in its portfolio. This is concerning to me and others because we support the Morro Bay.
Betty, can anybody else hear Betty?
I cannot hear Betty.
No, I cannot.
Okay, Zeke, I'm sorry, Betty cut out. Is she still on the line?
Yeah, let's see if we can get Betty back.
Thank you.
Betty, are you there? Betty, are you there?
Okay, am I muted again?
Okay, Betty, sorry, you left off with the notation regarding MBCP power purchase. Go ahead.
Okay, and my concern here is that now they've accepted nuclear into what is supposed to be green energy. And I believe this MBC has now broken its promise to be different from PG&E. And the deal that they've accepted about PG&E has been rejected by three other similar carriers in the state. So what this does for us is it gives us higher price energy. It's energy that we have already paid for with the exit fees. And so I would like to ask council there has to be a contract between PG&E and the Monterey Bay community. So I'm asking the council to reject that contract and to communicate that concern to San Luis, who is I think the reigning position on the board right now. That's one topic. My other topic is, and it's in light of what the city attorney said, that there was nothing reportable out of closed session. So could you please confirm whether or not we own the property that you was under negotiation with? It would assume that we are not owners of that property. And I would like to know if that's true. And then if not, when will it be coming to open session to conclude that we own it? And then my third topic is I want to make the council aware of, if they aren't already, that the Corps of Engineers is proposing to organize a committee to look at munitions recovery on the sand spit from World War II. And whether or not the city will be involved with that or not, I don't know. And I know that it's state park property, but the spit is right outside our front door on our bay. And I'm wondering if we want to be involved on that committee. And that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Appreciate that. Zeke, go ahead with our next public comment.
All right. Go ahead, commenter. Marty. Marty Lamelli.
I didn't want to comment on this item. I was looking for C1.
You can comment now, Marty, if you want to, or you can wait for C1, your preference.
I'm just here to answer any questions that the council have as a facilitator for the lease policy.
Okay, so we'll put you on hold, Zeke, until we get to item C1. Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Sure. The next caller, Zeke, for public comment.
I have a few people, quite a few people in the queue, but nobody has their hands raised at this moment.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you are on hold, you need to raise your hand so that we can get you in the queue to speak for public comment. Otherwise, we have no idea that you want to speak on this item. Any hands raised? Zeke?
No, sir.
So, folks on the line for public comment, if you'll look at the screen, if you are able to get in and look at channel 20, you can, in one moment, see the process for raising your hand. And if you're using Zoom, there should be a little button, or if you're calling in, what's the process for that, Zeke? They have to press...
If they're on a dial-up phone, it would be *9.
Okay.
To raise their hand.
*9 if you're on a dial-in phone, if you'd like to raise your hand for public comment, or use the raise hand button on Zoom if you have called in via Zoom. Okay, any hands up, Zeke?
No, sir.
Okay, with that, then I'll just wait. Let me just wait 1 second here and see if we get anybody that does want to speak. I don't want to cut it off too soon. So we'll just wait a minute here. And let me know, Zeke, if you would, sir, if a hand is raised. Hearing or seeing no hands raised, I will close general public comment and bring it back. I'll just address Mr. Weiss's comments. Thank you, John, for raising the issue of the tremendous budget shortfalls that the city will be trying to rectify with regard to COVID-19. Please note that we have agendized a special discussion of the budget on 5/26. That's the next city council meeting, which will start at, I believe, 3 p.m. Is that correct, Mr. Collins? Budget discussion?
Yes, sir, I believe that's true. It sounds about right. It's either 3 or 3:30. Yeah.
Thank you. So, folks in the community, if you do have input and or you want to call in at that time, that meeting is 5/26 at 3 p.m. That will be a special meeting to have the budget for the next fiscal year presented with regard to how we're going to balance the budget. With that, I'll go to Ms. Winholtz's comments. Mr. Collins, did you want to speak to the Morro Bay community power issue raised and the fact that the policy board or group has made a recommendation, but the full board has not acted as of yet, and any other comments regarding that action?
Yeah, I understand that the board met several months ago and was looking at a couple different options regarding a purchase. Three alternatives, or really one recommendation and two alternatives, and it was really about dollar savings and also whether to move forward with the Diablo attributes. Ultimately, the other alternatives would be far more costly, or there wouldn't be the carbon-free power purchase. So that was the deliberation was about. Unfortunately, there was discussion by Mayor Harmon about concerns regarding Diablo Canyon, particularly for SLO County customers. And there was commitments to doing outreach, and unfortunately that didn't occur because of COVID-19 that MBCP was going to conduct. So at this time, I think the decision has been made, and it was unanimous, and that includes representation from 19 or 20 different jurisdictions. So they looked at this pretty carefully.
And it's my understanding, I'll just add that it does not extend the life of Diablo Canyon as a nuclear power plant. This does not have any implications for that as well. Okay, and then also, Mr. Niermeyer, if you could address, Betty had a general comment about, do we own the WRF property? And there's an easement that I believe she's referring to on the closed session agenda that we had today. Could you give an update, not on that meeting, obviously, because it was a closed session, but if you could give an update on her question with regard to the question of, do we own the property? If you would mind handling that, sir. Thank you.
Yes, the Tri-W property the city purchased. There was a closed session item for a temporary construction easement and for easements that the city is negotiating right now. So in regards to the closed session item, without going further into the discussion that council had lawfully in closed session, that property itself is something that, we have a temporary construction easement right now, and we're negotiating a final purchase price. If that answers the question.
That does answer the question, and obviously you can't disclose the essentials of our closed session discussion until action is ready to be taken. So thank you for that. And then lastly, Rob, if you're on, could you please respond to Betty's question about the Corps of Engineers? I'm unaware of the fact that there might be a munitions recovery occurring on the sand spit, even though that's not on Morro Bay property. But is any staff member, Rob or Scott, aware of that? And can you comment on it?
This is Rob. I know that munitions were used on the... Is anybody hearing me? My Zoom just froze.
Yes, I can hear you. You're good.
Okay, good. On the sand spit in and around the community, there was a public outreach a few months ago, but we have not been apprised from the Corps of Engineers of the status of that, and we can look into that.
Great. Appreciate that. Possibly we could make a comment at the next meeting with regard to that issue. Good. So with that, I will bring it back to us and move on to the consent agenda. We are on item A, consent agenda. I will open up, general public comment for our consent agenda and ask Zeke if there's any public comment for our consent agenda.
No, Mr. Mayor. There is one person with their hand raised. Just a moment.
Okay. Thank you.
Betty Winholtz, you're on.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Betty, welcome.
Thank you. I want to read the email that I sent to the council this morning. It says, I appreciate your bringing this item forward I'm referring to item A5, referring to the PG&E, actually not PG&E, to the power plant property and the Department of Toxic Substance Control, who's asked for community input. So I appreciate your putting this on the agenda because the power plant site is a key feature of Morro Bay. Its development, whatever that might be, is of curiosity and importance to residents. What is of curiosity to me is why the city and the Coastal Commission are willing to let PG&E, in a sense, off the hook for contamination cleanup beyond the industrial level. The Department of Toxic Substances states that in their public notice that, quote, PG&E remains responsible for investigating and addressing environmental conditions resulting from historical power generation activities, unquote. However, the land use covenant that the PG&E wants signed releases them from further responsibility. And therefore, it throws the burden on whoever the current owner or future owner will be. And to me, this is a detriment to redevelopment. And as it states in the staff report, that developer could eventually be the city of Morro Bay if we get it for $1 in the 1930s. Or I apologize, the 2030s. So, because it says the city also retains its land use entitlement agreement. So I'm suggesting that we make comment now. In addition, common sense would suggest that injecting clean water from our WRF next to or near, but not in, the areas of concern, the polluted areas, does not prevent the water and chemicals from commingling underground. And therefore, the wells and WRF components are not located on top of each other, so says the staff report, but yet they are next to each other. And then what about saltwater intrusion? Is the city asking for a bigger problem down the road by not insisting that PG&A do a higher level of cleanup now for us? And then I opine that I believe the WRF is becoming an albatross around the neck of the city by scoping how we address various issues that are tangential to the WRF, and that I'm wondering if we're making the best decisions at this point. Thank you. That's my comment.
Thank you, Betty. Very much appreciated. Zeke, any other comments on the consent agenda, sir?
No, sir. There are nobody with their hands raised.
Very well. Thank you. I will then close public comment on our consent agenda, bring it back to council. I will go ahead and pull item number A-5 for further discussion, given Ms. Windholz's comments, to hopefully clarify those and ask council if there are any other items to pull. If not, I would entertain a motion for approval of the remainder items.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to pull item A4.
A4. Thank you, Councilmember McPherson. Any others?
I'll move.
Okay.
I'll move
No others? All right. Go ahead, Councilmember Addis.
I'll move to approve A1, 2, 3, 6, and 7.
Second.
Motion by Councilmember Addis to approve consent agenda items A1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. Second by Councilmember McPherson. Any discussion? If not, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember McPherson?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. And Councilmember McPherson, item A4, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm generally supportive, but I just had a few questions that I wanted answered first, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Of our city manager. I just wanted to know when the visitor center contract was actually terminated, first of all. And then if we pay them by the month, did we save the months since it's been closed? So if I could get an answer to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I don't have the specific date, but it was closed at the end of April. Sorry, end of March, early April. That being the termination of the contract. We pay in advance, so in reality, we'll save for the months of May and June. April was already paid for in March. So we won't be paying for the months of May and June for this fiscal year. And as it's discussed, we don't plan to reopen or get into a contract for visitor center services for next fiscal year at this time.
Right. No, I understand that. But the amount you're requesting in addition is not quite as much because we're not paying the full visitor center contract.
Yes.
Uh-huh. And then I noticed that you made the contract retroactive, and I just wanted to know if that is illegal, if we can do that, make the contract effective April 1st.
Yeah, I mean, since we were doing, council gave us that direction at the emergency meeting in March. I want to say it was the 19th. And so we worked with the chamber and they started providing that extra service. And so, according to the city attorney, it's okay to backdate, but in reality it wasn't the formal authority, but the council by consensus said, please move forward because they're assisting the city significantly through this COVID pandemic response.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, one of the items that is in the new contract is that the chamber will review the city's development process. And I just want to know when that will occur or when it will start and when we might expect to see, hopefully in the next fiscal year. I just wanted to confirm that because it's
that was a great question. That was the general notion of planning review was included in the current this year's contract with the chamber and sort of a support function. I think they're wanting to take more of a leading role, which is really helpful. And I know that Mr. Graham has already done some work internally in terms of getting more data and being able to track how they're doing and making some changes to help improve efficiency. I think it's going to be one of those things where we want to do really well and have good participation with city staff. So I think we probably need to get through the budget process. And so probably looking into the summer months or early fall to kick off a good process. So it's largely dependent on kind of the other factors that we can't control, but we would like to get moving soon on it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will move approval of item A4.
Do we have a second?
I'll second. I'll second.
Thank you. Motion by Councilmember McPherson to approve item A4, seconded by Councilmember Addis. And any discussion?
I have some, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, please go ahead.
I have a few questions. I've read this a few times and I'm sorry, but I'm confused by what this is saying. So bear with me here. So the visitor center is no longer going to be a visitor center, that building. Is that correct?
Right. Yes, sir. As of now, there's no visitor center functioning, and thus there's no contract for visitor center service. So
will the Rock 97.3 be in that building still, or so they'll still be there?
Yes, the building isn't going away. The only at this point, the only functional difference is that you don't have a visitor center staff, but you still have chamber staff are still there, which is primarily Erica and one support staff member. So
they'll still be there, and it's $1 a year lease apparently.
Yes, and they provide. Sorry, go ahead.
The chamber pays that, and that takes care of the radio station and everything else in there. The radio station pays a low rate on I think a low monthly rate on their piece, and then there may be a couple other things that are in there. And the chamber has $1 a month because they essentially manage the building and take care of the internal portions of it. If there's any kind of maintenance needs that are handyman style kind of things, that's our consolidated maintenance teams take care of that, but they take care of the day-to-day management of the building, and that's where that rate comes from. And then help me with the math here. So we're subsidizing the chamber, as I understand it, which we've been doing for quite a while apparently. What is the total amount we're paying the chamber at this point per year if you add in this economic development services, enhanced services, et cetera?
Yes.
Is it $78,000 a year, or what is that dollar amount?
Yes, as of now, it would be for that new amount of $78,000. There is no payment for visitor center services. It used to be $50,000 a year. increment for the contract support has moved up from, I think initially it was about 40,000 a couple of years ago, into looking into next year it would be at 78,000, and that is commensurate with the level of service that they're providing the city, whether it's outreach on our behalf or the helping with website development or doing outreach or supporting the city with regional efforts.
Okay. So because of the financial situation that we're in now, I'm looking at every dollar and questioning it. And I did some research on chambers of commerce, and apparently the vast majority are completely self-funded, including San Luis Obispo, Cayucas, Los Osos. So are we in a financial position that we should be funding a chamber of commerce?
It's a good policy question, and I guess the way I look at it is, if we didn't have Erica to assist us in through this contract, then we wouldn't have economic development, because that's what we had a deputy city manager to do, and I cut that position 2 weeks into my job here, saved the city about $150,000 in doing so, and had effectively no economic development support whatsoever. And the council made it a top priority, and they said they wanted an ombudsman. And that's what we moved forward with the chamber. So they are providing direct economic development services to the city. If we were to pull out of that contract, then I wouldn't have anybody doing economic development work.
So does this come from the budget line?
It's out of our economic development fund, which is funded by the Senate Bill 1090 revenues, the Diablo closure. Those monies are restricted for economic development purposes, so this doesn't affect the general fund.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Appreciate that. Any other discussion? If not, roll call vote.
Councilmember McPherson?
Yes.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. That takes it to A5. Ms. Winholtz had a number of questions regarding the item of regarding the Department of Toxic Substances Control draft statement and basis. First, Chris, can you respond to the issue of quote unquote, the city is letting PG&E off the hook, and I assume that means for cleanup. Can you kind of explain the legal relationship and what the DTSC has control over and what this item is, and or Mr. Collins, you can certainly chime in as well.
Sure. So in short, the land use covenant that is being proposed to DTSC by a private party is to allow for limited use of the property in anticipation of having some future near-term use. It is not determining the fate of the entire property. It is not saying what can or can't be done for the entire property. And it's also not saying that PG&E is relieved of any obligations it currently has to do cleanup. The current property owner, my understanding of why the current property owner is seeking this land use covenant is because they anticipate at some point in the near future, some sort of limited use on that property. And so they're getting clearance for that particular property use. But this is not establishing in any way or shape or form what the future of the property is, or changing any current obligations PG&E has to do cleanup or to not do cleanup. Frankly, it's remained an open question on whether or not PG&E has significant duties and when they might have significant duties to do some cleanup, but this is not going to impact the status quo. So hopefully that answers the question about what this land use covenant is and what its impact will be on the property.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then I know in the staff report, we covered the issue with regard to the wastewater treatment facility and the AOCs that have been mentioned, but either Rob, Scott, and or Chris, could you speak to the issues, if there are any, with regard to toxic substance intrusion into wells or areas where we're seeking easements, and or the additional question about saltwater intrusion.
Yeah, just generally speaking, and Rob probably fill in the blanks if you want more technical. Both our team has looked at it, and then the DTSC team looked at it to confirm that there is no impacts in both directions. In other words, the wharf project will not affect this, and the areas of contamination do not affect the wharf site, as well as our existing wells on the premises. But I'll let Rob speak to the saltwater intrusion and anything else that I missed without going into great detail unless the council wants it, because he could talk for a while on it.
Go ahead, Rob.
In my opinion, saltwater intrusion is really unrelated to this DTSC action. Saltwater intrusion occurs when there's overpumping of wells in an adjacent connected groundwater aquifer. So it's going to happen regardless of what happens with this land use covenant, should there be overpumping of groundwater. From a technical basis, yes, DTSC looked at it. Our hydrogeological team looked at it, and based on their modeling efforts, shows really no adverse impacts from this shallow contamination that exists on the site.
Great. Thank you all for that explanation. And with that, I'll move for approval of item A5.
Second.
Motion by Mayor Heading for approval of A5, second by Councilmember McPherson. Any other discussion?
I have a couple of questions, if I might.
Absolutely, certainly.
So, Chris, maybe you can help me with this. My understanding is that when PG&E sold the property, they continued to assume all liability for hazardous materials. When they sold it to Dynegy, they were still on the hook, so to speak, for dealing with the contaminated materials. And when Dynegy sold it to Vistra, they still maintain responsibility for possible contaminants on the entire site. Is that a fair statement?
I would have to take a look at the exact purchase and sale agreement, but that's my understanding. I would hesitate to say conclusively, but I believe that is the case.
Okay, so I imagine that PG&E is trying to limit their liability to get this land use covenant in place, which makes sense to me. It seems to me, though, if the city has concerns about how the property might be used in the future, that we should weigh in on this, even if it has no impact on whether this LUC gets approved or not. And in looking at the different areas of concern, I look at the substation and I think, well, that's going to be PG&E's for a long time, foreseeable future. So I'm not too concerned about that. That middle portion between the plant and the substation, that's where Vistra wants to put battery storage potentially. I don't have a lot of concerns about that. Then there's the plant itself, which obviously is a big deal. But in looking at areas of concern 1, 2, and 3, which is the old tank farm and that big portion of the property that's closer to the ocean, it seems to me the city has some interest in that being cleaned up to the extent that it could be used for residential use in the future. I plan to write the DTSC and make that recommendation, but I'm wondering, shouldn't the city or is the Coastal Commission weighed in on this? Do they care one way or the other if it remains industrial commercial?
So I would assume that everybody would like to see, the plant cleaned up, short of whoever's paying for it. And that is, I believe, a separate issue than this specific proposal before the DTSC. Again, the land use covenant that's been proposed by Dynegy Vistra to the DTSC is basically seeking permission for limited use of the property. Right. They would not be able to do even the industrial limited development that they're proposing or will propose if they didn't have the DTSC clearance. And so, this land use covenant is basically saying that, yes, you can use parts of the property for this limited industrial use. They're getting a clearance from the state on that. But the fate of the rest of the property is not being determined by this specific action. In regards to the global question of when or if the property will be cleaned up, that of course is a very important larger community issue, but that is separate from this specific proposal. Certainly the city, the public, any interested party could provide public comment to the DTSC in regards to this LUC, the land use covenant, that goes beyond what decision they're making. The city or the public could certainly weigh in and say, by the way, now that you're looking at this property and you're considering this limited proposal, we want to remind you that there's a global issue involved. But to be clear, that's not what the DTSC is deciding for this proposal. But I certainly, it certainly resonates, I would assume with the community and, does with me that, the global issue is one that, should be addressed at some point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Mr. Mayor, we had an informal conversation about that. Do you think it's appropriate for the city to take a position on this, or what are your thoughts about that?
Personally, this issue was initiated by Dynegy, aka Vistra, which is the current owner, in anticipation of spinning off the remainder parcel, absent the area where they, and we've previously discussed this, have proposed and then withdrawn their proposal to the city to build a lithium-ion battery facility. The intent is to identify the AOCs and issues associated with them so that as they move forward towards either spinning off portions of the property and or moving towards a master plan development with a potential suitor, that the individuals who potentially might buy the property or be interested in the property would know exactly what would be required for those areas and how mitigation would have to occur. The city at this time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, cannot insist that either PG&E or Vistra clean up the property. However, we maintain our $1 buyout option, the $1 buyout option that I believe expires in, or would be triggered in 2034.
Yes.
That would allow us to take over the property. And my sense is that there would be much more conversation and much more desire on the part of the current owner to get that cleaned up and get that available for development. And we maintain a seat at the table with regard to that $1 issue. And I believe we reported on that a number of times that Vistra has asked us to relinquish that. And we've adamantly said, no, we are not going to do that. If I could, any clarification, Chris, on that? I just want to.
No, that is accurate. And again, just to emphasize that the issue before the Department of Toxic Substances Control on whether or not to approve the proposed land use covenant is not a global decision on if the property will be cleaned up and what the future of the entire property is. It's really a limited clearance, if you will, that the current property owner is seeking from the Department of Toxic Substances Control for a future use that they couldn't do unless they get this clearance. Now, does this raise the bigger issue of when will the property be cleaned up? What's the city going to do with it? Well, yes, it does, but they're two separate issues. They're not linked inherently.
I understand that. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for that, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate that.
Sure.
I will be sending a letter to DTS asking that AOC 1, 2, and 3 be allowed for planned uses in the future, although I don't think it'll have an impact, as you mentioned, Chris, on this particular process. But I think it's important for the city to take a position on this. And I'm going to talk to the Coastal Commission to see if they have any concerns. So thank you for talking about that in some detail. I appreciate it.
And thank you for your questions. With that, if there's no more discussion, we do have a motion on the table, and I will ask for roll call.
Mayor Heading,
Yes.
Councilmember McPherson,
Yes.
Councilmember Addis,
Yes.
Councilmember Davis,
Yes.
Councilmember Heller.
No.
Motion carries 4-1.
Thank you. That ends the consent agenda, and that will move us to item C-1, presentation of the Harbor Department Lease Management Policy Working Group final draft document for City Council review, input, and direction. Let it be noted that staff is seeking council input on the proposed lease management policy update. And there are a number of specific items they've requested us to comment on. So we are not taking any action on this item tonight. However, we are giving general input to staff. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Endersby and or Mr. Collins for the presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Mayor and council members. This is Eric's show, but I just wanted to kick it off and thank the council for giving direction over a year ago to look into this issue that's been brewing for quite some time. And furthermore, thank our harbor director, Mr. Endersby, for his tireless efforts to not only continue to manage the waterfront, but also look into the future with this stellar plan that they're bringing forward. And also thank former interim city manager Marty Lamelli for helping to shepherd this process as well and provide his city manager guru-ness to the process at no charge, which would have cost us well over $100,000 or $200,000 if we had hired a consultant, and we would have gotten a worse product for the wearer. So I just wanted to thank those two gentlemen for their significant efforts, as well as the ad hoc, the city council committee on this, which is Councilmember McPherson and Davis, for helping as well shepherd this process through. And I'll let Eric introduce the members of the actual ad hoc team that comprise folks that have a good deal of knowledge and expertise on the waterfront and brought a wealth of knowledge and creative ideas to this process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric Endersby. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate it, but it was very much a group effort that we definitely could not have done without the working group members and without Marty and working group members past and present. As I'll tell you, a couple had to bow out and we replaced them, but it was a long effort. I think I initially back last year gave it like a 3 or 4 month estimate to get it done, and that was, I think, met with some criticism then and warranted criticism. And looking back in hindsight, I definitely think we took them out. We ended up taking as much time as we thought we needed, which ended up being over a year, which I think made for a better document in the end. Everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay. I know my video is not very good. I haven't quite mastered the technical aspects of this very much. So I'm going to ask Dana to pull up the PowerPoint that I created for this. She's going to steer through that as I speak. Purpose tonight, and then you guys got it as a city council, and the public got it a while ago. Yesterday when it was published as well, so if they want to refer to that, but it's really going over the staff report. So purpose tonight, obviously, present this to city council, take public or other comment, take some council direction on a final document. I'm calling it a final version because we have the final draft here, at least the final working group draft, and then refer you, make sure you're aware of all the attachments. I know there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of documents. Attachment 1 is the conveyance letter from the lease policy group, the working folks that helped me put this together. They're sort of, here it is, council, here's what we think you need to look at, and here's some recommendations. Attachment 2 is our draft policy document itself. Attachment 3 is some input from the Morro Bay Chamber of Commerce. Obviously, we had Erica Crawford on the working group, but we also got direct chamber input to the final document. There's attachment 4 is a memo from the city attorney regarding a lease financing issue that I'll talk about later. Attachment 5 is a letter from the State Lands Commission attorney, again, referencing that lease site financing issue that I'll speak of later. And finally, document 6 is the original Harbor Department lease management policy document that we started with. That was our beginning part. So group-wise, it's a little further on in the PowerPoint, but I definitely acknowledge Marty Lamelli and bringing his great facilitating efforts to the table. And I think the city manager referred to him very appropriately as the guru with his 40 some odd years of experience. I really appreciate what he brought. And he didn't just sit and facilitate. He gave us input along the way as well, based on all his experience and his expertise, which was wonderful. Also on the group was Mark Blackford from the Harbor Advisory Board. He had to bow out a couple months in for personal reasons. He brought a good amount of business expertise and sense to the table. Erica Crawford, who I spoke of earlier from the Morro Bay Chamber, brought the business community to the table. Bob Fowler, he's one of our leaseholders at Morro Bay Landing, just down the street from our office here. He brought the lease and private developer and businessman sense to the table. Sharice Hansen represented the Harbor Advisory Board, but she ended up later in the process also representing lease and a subleasee on the waterfront, so she brought some good experience there. Joan Solu, Morro Bay Chamber, Morro Bay citizen, former hotelier. Everybody knows Joan. She brought pretty much the most energy we've ever seen to any sort of activity. She was all over the place, taking on jobs and roles and bringing back homework assignments on time and under budget regularly. Ron Reisner, he was later appointed after Smith Held, who was one of our other leaseholders, was on the group. Ron Reisner was appointed from the Harbor Advisory Board. And then my staffers, my own staff member, Lori Stiltz, business coordinator, who helped a lot. Then again, Smith Held, he had to bow out for personal reasons a couple months in, about the same time Mark Blackford did. We elected not to replace his position as a leaseholder because we had Sharice Hansen. And at that time, she was a master leaseholder because she got the lease ship at the lease site there at the 87, 88. So together, great working group, and I can't thank them enough. It could not have happened without them. Some of them, I think, are trying to join on the webinar here. I guess probably now is as good a time as any before I go into any sort of the staff report. I did ask if any of them wanted to come and make a quick statement on what their experience or how they felt the process went and what the product was. So if there's any of them that want to raise their hand out there, if Dana can bring them in, if any of them are on board. I'm not sure if they all were successful in getting the whole Zoom thing going or not.
So Eric, they're in as attendees, and if they raise their hand, then Zeke can allow them to speak one at a time, or I can stop sharing your screen and add them as panelists.
Okay, we have Ron and
Perfect.
Joan. Do you want one at a time or?
Yeah, one at a time.
Okay, so go ahead, Ron.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. Eric has more than adequately described the process. I think the document speaks for itself as far as I'm concerned and what my interests and concerns are relative to a policy. It's important for me to say that the policy update is a refinement and a furtherance of the existing policy. So there are a number of policy mechanisms and revenue mechanisms that are embedded in that document. During the review process, or during my participation in the process, a number of issues became clear to me that are not necessarily embedded in the current policy, and either the old one or the new one. To address just two of them, and I think the Chamber working group identified this as well. Using title and lease monies for the purposes of operating the Harbor Department, given the revenue stream for the last couple of years and certainly looking forward, is simply not sustainable. So other revenue sources are going to have to be found, irrespective of the configuration of the Harbor Department itself moving forward. But in addition to that, to the needs of the Harbor Department, we have the needs of the waterfront itself. And while we're all very, very concerned about the impact on tourism moving forward. Eventually, and hopefully in not terribly long from now, that situation, the current situation, will resolve itself. But when it does, we still have what is, in my opinion, from a business standpoint, not a sustainable business model. So other revenue sources, I think, have to be identified, such as, we've all talked about this, things before, such as parking revenue, a business improvement district, or other sources. The one possibility is which is not addressed or not embedded in the current policy, either the old one or the new one, is a financing plan for more equitable sharing of waterfront maintenance and harbor operations, which, as you all know, on council, is restricted to the west side of the Embarcadero, i.e. the Titleist properties. And I feel strongly that the waterfront is larger and in a broader revenue base than simply, and I'm not diminishing them, that simply the Titleist lease sites that are currently operating. There are other businesses and other activities along the waterfront that are not contributing to, let's just say, the harbor fund, if you will, that I think need to, and I think that's important. I think both from a practical standpoint and from an equity standpoint. The second issue has to do with the much debated point during our working group and about whether a lease owner should be able to seek financing on the basis of his improvements, not the dirt, because the dirt doesn't belong to him. It's the state's dirt. We all know that. And Eric has presented in his staff report very clear bit of information about state lands and what their position is. The city attorney has contributed to that. The staff report also points out that there are at least two jurisdictions, Titleist trust jurisdictions in the state of California that operate other than what state land seems to be willing to do. To my knowledge, and I'm not an attorney and I'm not an expert or even slightly an expert, but I read a great deal about all this during our working time, and I don't see that there are any state restrictions. And I'm talking about the Titleist Act. There are no state restrictions that would prevent a leaseholder from pledging their own improvements and rents, for that matter, but that may be a separate issue as far as the city is concerned, to secure financing. For instance, and this is in the staff report, the Port of San Diego has, for quite some time now, and at present time, has policy, which was, a formal policy which was agreed to by the port, that states there should not be any restrictions on how the tenant utilizes the proceeds of financing as long as the district is satisfied that proper underwriting guidelines are met. So that's a couple of the issues that came to my mind. The first one I think is extraordinarily important, and that has to do with the general revenue and the general financing of the waterfront area. And the second one has to do with the ability of the city, and Mr. Fowler has addressed this in a couple of communications to the city council very effectively. It has to do with the city's ability to attract folks that you would like to have, business people that you would like to have operating on the waterfront, operating in a well-financed way and for a long period of time. And I would, irrespective of what state lands might or might not say, I don't see any law. I don't see it. And apparently the Port of San Diego doesn't see it. Thank you.
Okay, we have Joan Soule. Hello, Joan.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? AGP?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so, well, good evening, City Council. I have some notes here. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank Eric Endersby and Lori for all of their assistance through this. I have to be honest with you, I've lived in Morro Bay for 20 years, and my family has operated several businesses in Morro Bay, but we were never leaseholders. So I didn't have the in-depth experience that I would say the other group members had with understanding how the lease process worked and exactly what went into operating a lease or negotiating a policy or an actual lease. So I appreciate all of the back and forth between Eric and myself and Lori and myself, bringing me up to speed and allowing me to do some deep dives into questions that other members of the group didn't have because they already had a much broader understanding of those questions. I'd also like to thank our other group members for tolerating me asking them the redundancy of my question of why is it that way? Why? And them always being willing to answer my redundancy. The working group, I think, was a very diverse mix. We set the ground rules almost immediately and spelled them out in the first meeting. We all agreed to speak frankly to each other without any animosity or resentment once we got through an issue or stepped out of the room. We really did value each other's opinions, and those opinions, I believe, were really well put forward due to the amount of research that we did. Initially, we broke up, we had enough members to break up into larger groups. Half of us would, for example, study Northern California leaseholds, and half of us would study Southern California leaseholds and bring back the information to the group for kind of a roundtable. As we got further down, we drilled down further into the lease information that came back. And I do have to say that, you know, for Morro Bay, it's difficult to get an apples to apples lease policy information squarely placed across the board with our other comp set cities or harbor departments. For example, early in the process, we study, as a resident, I've been listening, let me back up. As a resident, I've been listening to picnic conversation and dinner party conversation about what's going on with the leases, the lease policy, the leaseholds down on the Embarcadero since I've lived here for 20 years. So I really did try and approach this with all of those conversations in my mind. And that's why I think I asked so many questions. So when I really took a look at Morro Bay compared to other municipalities, apples to apples, we are not, I'm just going to be honest with you, we're a grape compared to a watermelon in some of these instances. For example, you know, Morro Bay, we have about a mile or a mile and a half of leasehold, Tylen's Trust leasehold lands right there that create master leases. In San Francisco, they have over 9 linear miles of leaseholds, 9 linear miles that they do everything from dry docking to bringing in mats and freighters. And then they have, you know, a souvenir shop and restaurants. So they have a huge array of, you know, what we were trying to stack ourselves up against. So I tried to work and stress the importance of creating balance between the city's needs and the community expectations and the leaseholder's responsibility. As the resident representative for you on the group, I personally want to relay the concerns that I had heard over the number of years and bring those forward during the working group so that the working group, if they were unaware of those issues, we could try and address those in this. Some of the areas that I need to mention that this group worked very, very hard on and focused on specifically are N in the policy, N, like in Nancy, the lease site monitoring, inspection, and maintenance. This area of the policy is greatly expanded now. And I think you'll see, if you hold the two policies side by side, the old one and the proposed one, you'll see that some of the highlights will include language spelling out the process and timeline for lease site inspection from sea to curb. What agencies may be part of an inspection team? The timeline for maintenance inspections on a rotational basis at a minimum of every 5 years. And the maintenance also newly defines the public areas and rights of way used by the leaseholders during normal business operations as the leaseholder's responsibility now, keeping them in a broom clean condition. Q, percent gross sales audits. I can tell you that we had no less than 4 meetings where we discussed this. And our meetings were very long, never contentious, but diverse opinions were laid out on the table. This area, gross percent sales audits, now requires the annual submission to the city of all applicable business sales tax records as submitted to the state of California, in addition to the hotel room night sales and transient occupancy tax payments as submitted to the city with the master tenant's annual percent gross sales report each year for comparison, while still reserving the city's right to conduct a traditional audit. In other words, now the city has 2 ways, 2 measurements to make sure that they are receiving the revenues that are due to them through their partnership. T, the financial criteria and financing considerations. This area now has 5 key components to help the city make a determination of whether or not a master tenant or a proposed master tenant or subtenant is financially acceptable and is a financially acceptable partner that the city will wish to do business with. And finally, the conveyance letter, I believe, is a solid overview of the process we use to create the document that's before you tonight. The key to the successful future for the waterfront lies within the harbor lease management policy. Please remember that the harbor lease management policy is just the skin of the balloon. It's just the outside shell. All of the documents, including the lease, licensing agreements, and everything else that has to be contained on the interior of that skin, are just as important and will determine what the future of our waterfront is. How the waterfront will look, function, and create economic growth to support the harbor department and the residents in our community will be incumbent on the city adopting and implementing a policy that puts the vision and the direction of the lease sites into the city's hands of this and future city councils. So this document is going to set the framework for how, for at least the next 5 years, because we're recommending that you review the document or have the document reviewed and cleaned, scrubbed every 5 years. It's very, very important to the future, both economically and for public use, that the document is one that the community can live with and that city councils can use for a guidance and direction. I did read last week, I did read the Chamber's letter in response to this, and I would encourage you to get more information. As Eric has recommended, we do need to come back, or the city needs to come back and have more information provided to them on the percent rent versus going to a flat rent or a static rent structure. I disagree personally with the static rent structure. I can tell you this from negotiating business. I'm going to say it, you set the price and I'll set the terms. And I guarantee you that if you thought you got a good price, if I set the terms, I'll make more money on the deal than you do. And the reason why is because the terms are just as significant as the actual price. And the city would have to increase the static cost of rent to more than double what it would be in most instances. On the rent, on the leases, on the master leases where the city receives gross percent rent, I believe that the city is receiving a much higher percentage than they would with the static rent. And I'll leave it at that. That's for you to decide. But I do want to say that for the future of the waterfront, it is really important for the city to use the visionary documents that it has and to further likely develop a Tidelands Trust leasehold visionary document that in the future will give the city the ability to guide how the properties look, what the feel is, and what the tone is for our community. And I appreciate you allowing me to be on this working group. It was a lot of fun, believe it or not. It went longer than I thought it would. It was a lot of fun, and it's a good group of very respectful folks who value their community and really love this community and gave this document their all. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Joan. I'm going to jump in and keep moving on the agenda here. If anybody else, I'm not sure who else got on from our group, but they can jump in public comment if they like. So perfect. Danny, you got to recommendations. So what we're recommending, obviously, the council is review this policy and provide us any sort of input we'd like to move forward with. Alternatives onto the next page of the slides. Not presenting anything to you, just bringing you what we got here, a year and a half worth of work here. Fiscal impact, other than staff time, no real fiscal impacts to date. From a background, starting in 2018, the council had a goal objective to tighten up our auditing, both our financial auditing and physical auditing of our lease sites. And then that eventually rolled into 2019-20 goal objective to go with the whole lease management policy and update it all. Under goal number 1, objective number 9. November 2018, we we brought to the council a policy update and timeline. I think that's the one I referred to earlier when I thought I'd do it maybe in 3 or 4 months, but we'll take however much time we needed. Obviously, it's taken a lot more time, but I think it's been time well spent. After and in that meeting, also November 2018, the council directed the staff to work with Mr. Lamelli, Marty Lamelli, the former interim city manager, to be our facilitator. We had reached out to a few other folks to see if there was interest, professional interest in helping us out, and Marty graciously stepped forward, and it was great. He was a godsend. I can't thank him enough. Marty and I, after that, canvassed the community for good folks to sit on our working group. We had a number of people that were interested but couldn't because of time or other restrictions that they had in their personal lives. So we ended up with a great group of working folks that I won't go over again here. But we got a lot of work done. We operated entirely on a consensus basis. I think, Danny, you can move on to the next page. Yeah, there you go. Entirely on a consensus basis, even on issues where there was dissent or disagreement. And you'll hear a little bit more about the lease financing issue, although not all members agreed with the final language, that the policy that went into the policy document, but they agreed on the language if that's what the policy had to be. So really worked pretty organically in putting all that together. Our first meeting was held in January 2019. And that's, again, Mr. Blackford resigned a few months in. Harvard Advisory Board saw this updates along the way a few different times. And again, I said, it was it's kind of an organic process. We started with the existing lease policy template. I think Ron touched on that. We canvassed other organizations and agencies and found every other lease policy we can from coastal organizations, copied them, made them available to the group. We created a new expanded policy document outline as we looked at everybody else's stuff and looked at our group and figured out everything we wanted on our document and just made an outline of what all the different items were going to be. Then we took them one at a time, sometimes multiply. I think as Joan touched on, the groups kind of broke up into North and South or into different little subgroups to work on different issues, depending on what their expertise and experience was. Initially, staff was writing all the policy documentation, but eventually everybody ended up kicking in and writing policy wordage. Everything got filtered through myself and Lori Stilts. We would meet, review red lines from the previous meeting, approve them or change them, and then go on to our new stuff. And I'd take notes and Laura would take notes, and then we'd put it on at our next meeting and as new red lines, accepting the old ones as we went, kind of in a lather, rinse, repeat format. So we went section by section. We tackled some pretty heavy things more than once or for a long period of time. And to be honest with you, we were working on this right up to the day the agenda published. There was important stuff that needed to be included, so we made sure that we worked on it right up to the end. Along the way, as I stated, the Harbor Advisory Board provided, I think, to the Harbor Advisory Board 3 different times. The first time they provided some input, the second and third times were just for information, and then eventually they said, we'll trust the 2 members, Shreese Hansen and Ron Reisner, to do what they need to do and do the right thing. And so the Harbor Advisory Board decided they didn't need it back. Our 2 council members, McPherson and Davis, provided input and review along the way. I realize you all have seen it. The rest of the council members, really, probably the first time you've seen it was when the agenda published. And there's, like I say, there's a lot to digest there. We took input from our 2 council members. City attorney provided input and review on several different occasions. Chamber of Commerce, as you know, and they provided a very long letter with their review and input. And then Marty and I met with the Steves from McCarty and Davis, Steve McCarty and Steve Davis, the commercial real estate firm, to review. And really the input they gave was mostly conceptual, and really the main message they kept going back to was in dealing with our lease sites and mainly in future development, because that's really what they do. They market properties for development and redevelopment. They're not really property managers per se in their firm. And their main message was make sure the city's in charge when it comes to the future of these lease sites. Don't leave it entirely up to the leaseholders to decide what they want to do. Get the city more in the driver's seat. Dana, if you can move on to the next page, page 9. So the conveyance letter from the working group is attachment 1. I'm sure you've all read. It largely summed up the process, the key findings, everything, the main points that we wanted to get to. The lease policy documents included, the key issues, and I'll just go through these one by one, I guess. Mary, do you want me to stop periodically here and ask if there's any questions, or you want to just charge on?
No, let's go ahead and do the whole presentation, Eric, and then we'll open it up to questions. Thanks.
Okay. So I've got a bunch of paperwork here. I just want to make sure I've got everything I want and need in front of me. So the 4 main things that the lease policy group outlined, and I'll hit those, the numbered items in the staff report. Number 1, policy implementation and future lease management. Obviously, successful implementation of this is the key. We can't be a document that gets done and just sits on a shelf and doesn't do anything. It really needs to be properly implemented and maintained over the years and kept up with over the years. It is doing more, as Joan mentioned. We go a lot more into lease site physical management and auditing, and there's some other areas that we get more detailed in. That is going to take more effort and staff time, admittedly, but we've got to figure out a way to do this if we want to move kind of over the hill and go to a different methodology and a better methodology of managing our lease sites. The big question is in-house management, meaning within the harbor department with city personnel or private lease management. Either way will be a financial challenge. As you may recall, we had a business manager slated to be hired back in 2012 or 13 when the power plant announced it was closing early and we're going to lose $275,000 of revenue early. And then, that was shortly after the 2008 economic crash, and it just wasn't in the cards financially to do that position. And we just continued on with what we had. So it's going to be a financial challenge. If we go to some sort of contract management, and obviously there's a cost, but who knows what the payoff could be in the long run. If we go to contract, the working group recommended that the overall oversight of it remain with the harbor department as being kind of the body that has the bigger view of everything harbor related. Implementation strategies. Obviously, we're not just going to adopt this thing maybe in a month or 2 weeks and hit the ground running and put it in place. We really need to come up with some implementation strategies and how to bring this thing on over some period of time. And both that and how to manage in the future, we're recommending the council give us some input on, basically direct us to go do some research and bring back for approval what those implementation strategies might be and how a contract versus in-house management might work. And so I'm looking for that council input tonight. So that's sort of one of the first decision points. Also I'll try to refer to agenda page numbers, make it the easiest to flip through all these different things. In the updated policy itself, from the policy implementation letter, which is on page 61 of the council agenda, there's some bullet points under item E, basically what we believe the policy is bringing forward. And I think Joan touched on a few of them. What we really were striving for, and we had this sort of joking reference, is the person from, and this is no disparagement to the state of Kansas, but it was, can the person from Kansas, or can somebody from Kansas be able to pick this up and understand what they'd be getting into if they're reading an ad for a lease site RFP and they're interested in coming out to California and doing something. So we really kept referencing that and wanted to make it something that was clear, transparent, readable, and made sense to somebody that had no experience in terms of what our waterfront is like and what it might be like to run a business here. We improved the definition of a tenant in good standing. That was a pretty critical lease concept. The existing policy had some tenant in good standing language, but we didn't think it was as all-encompassing as it needed to be, so we tightened up on that. That's page, I think, 83 of the agenda packet. We framed some increased responsibility for the leaseholders on common area management. I think Ron touched on the concept of the whole waterfront as a common area, and folks across the street, having some responsibility because they obviously gain financially and otherwise from the overall Tidelands Trust. So we framed some increased responsibility for master leaseholders relative to the maintenance of different common areas, because I know that's been a criticism in the past. And we clarified the process for treatment when leases are getting near expiration, and whether we go with the existing tenant or go to RFP, and tried to make that more clear so that both an existing tenant could look at this and say, okay, this is what's going to happen when my lease is nearing expiration. If I want to continue on, this is what I better do. Or if I'm someone from the outside and want to apply to a request for proposals, they're going to know what they're getting into. So we tried to clarify that as best we could. We know the council was looking for a lot in this document. Some of the things they're looking for was in terms of the lease term itself, how many years to a lease, some sort of formulaic approach, which I'll touch on later. We tried to address as many council issues as we could as well. Next slide, Dana, page 10. So formula for determining the lease term, which is on page 73 of your agenda packet, which is in the lease management policy itself. That's the page that deals with the lease term. Again, I acknowledge the council's desire for something formulaic. Believe me, I would love to have something formulaic, or I could, x squared plus y squared equals z squared, and then we're done. We don't have to go through this, socio-political process of trying to figure out how long a lease term should be. We did not find any widespread systematic formula, sort of get this, spend this, get that approach over different agencies. The closest we got was the Unified Port of San Diego, which seemed to be probably the most comprehensive policy we found and most updated. It was surprising. There was a lot of fairly prominent and large agencies that didn't have any leasing policy at all. Some of them were very, very old, older than ours. So it was quite an eye-opener seeing what they had. Unified Port of San Diego had a very good policy. They basically had, and I touched on this in the staff report, policy that determines, okay, the leaseholder is going to build a retail, let's use the boatyard for an example, an all retail establishment. And that costs $1 million. The estimated replacement cost of that is $1 million. Well, it's an existing building there. He's going to go in and maybe spend $750,000 on a redevelopment, but not rebuild the whole thing. So in San Diego's vision, that person would get 75% of the replacement value of that building. So he'd get 75% of whatever the term of years that they had assigned for a retail building. And let's say it's 40 years. So they'd get 75%, they'd get 30 years. So theirs was the only formulaic approach they had. It relied pretty heavily on a fairly sophisticated process of cost estimation of buildings and lives of buildings, useful lives of buildings. And they're a large, sophisticated, and well-funded agency. And we looked at that, and while I'd love to have something like that, can we afford to accomplish something like that? I'm not sure we can. We've typically gone with sort of a historical list of factors when it comes to lease sites and how we assign terms. Terms meaning the overall number of years that a leaseholder gets. A lot of it is historical precedence. A lot of it is the size, depends, also kind of can depend on the size and development or redevelopment aspects of that lease site. Obviously, a smaller site, or one leaseholder might be able to spend $4 million on a redevelopment because the site is large enough to accommodate a building that would do something like that. Another leaseholder may not because it's a small building. Well, does the smaller guy get a smaller lease because he can't spend more on that site? So lots of factors go into that. So again, we didn't find a really great formula that applied one-on-one, but we tried, and again, San Diego seems to be the closest we got. Dana, next slide, page 11, which would be item 3 from the conveyance letter, lease site financing. This was the issue that I think Ron spoke about. This was fairly far on in the lease in our update process. We probably got to this in the late fall last year. And the notion is currently our lease site policy says that if you're going to get a loan on a lease site, and whether that's for buying the site, which we've had numerous people do, or finance a redevelopment, which we've had numerous people do, or refinance a lease site after redevelopment or a purchase, we've had leaseholders do that too. They've all done it. We've approved them on a regular basis. You've seen those documents come through. But the stipulation we have in our current lease policy is those loans, that lending, the proceeds from that lending can only be used for lease site purposes or public improvements associated with the lease site. In other words, we're not going to let you take out a loan for a lease site to go buy 10 acres over in Paso Robles to go build a condominium complex. It's got to stay in the Tidelands Trust. But there was interest in carrying that outside, looking to see if it was possible to allow that sort of lending, because as I think Ron touched on, it can be a stymieing, it can have a stymieing effect on we believe it could have a stymieing effect on an investment on our waterfront because it really restricts what you can do with that asset. We have a lot of leaseholders that are owner operators that don't plan to go do other developments, but we have a fair amount that are developers and folks, and those are the kind of folks we are interested in as well, to come in and develop and redevelop lease sites. And when you tie up X amount of millions of dollars in an asset that you can't use as collateral to go do something else somewhere else, it can have a negative effect, or it can have a stymieing effect. So we were interested in seeing if it was possible to loosen that up. We went to the State Lands Commission and got their legal opinion. I'll let City Attorney touch on that a little bit more. We found one agency that had a policy, and again, that was Unified Port of San Diego, that had a policy that said there is no restriction on how lease site financing can work, but there were some lending stipulations, following normal good lending practices, and the port reserved the right to take some proceeds from the loan or adjust the lease rent or do something. In other words, take a pound of flesh in order to allow a leaseholder to do that. We reached out to the Port of San Diego. I had a contact there through my CMB group that got me in touch with an attorney, a real estate attorney there. I tried to get that real estate attorney conversing with our city attorney, and I tried to stay in the middle of it. We never got any response back. Either they weren't interested or didn't want to spend the time and money on talking to a little agency like us. And despite several efforts, we never made any headway there. The city of Ventura, we had a draft lease from the Ventura Port District that had a term that in a draft lease that appeared to allow lease site financing for what we sort of call off-campus use, meaning not Tidelands use. But that wasn't a lease that was ever approved, and we never found anything further at Ventura, nor could we get anything out of Ventura. I asked the relatively new port manager there if I could speak with their city attorney about it, and their response was, well, our city attorney is expensive, and I'd rather you just talk to me. And he didn't know anything about it because he was brand new, so that was another dead end. So out of the analysis that city attorney did and our discussions with Chris Newmeyer, we believe, and we meaning staff primarily, because the working group I think was pretty unanimous in their feelings of wanting to loosen this financing issue up. We as staff believe that lease financing could be used anywhere in the Tidelands. It didn't have to be restricted to the leasehold interest itself, but say a leaseholder wanted to go buy another lease and could use leasehold A for collateral for buying leasehold B, that would be okay. So I'm going to stop talking for a second, take a sip of water, and ask Chris to step in and fill in his part on the memo he put out to you folks and what the State Lands Commission gave. Chris?
Sure. Thank you, Eric, for that summary of the Tidelands leasing issue. So this was a very interesting issue that was brought to me on how much we could relax the current financing policy for Tideland leasehold interests. And after reviewing the issue, it was clear to me that we could relax it to at least allow financing secured from leasehold interests to be used elsewhere in the Tidelands Trust. So the policy is being relaxed in that regard. The bigger question posed was whether or not it would be lawful to allow financing to occur on leasehold interests that was proposing the financing to be used outside of the Tidelands Trust. This issue was something that, as I'd mentioned in my legal opinion, there's no definitive court case on this. And so I thought it was important to ask the State Lands Commission their opinion. The State Lands Commission clearly expressed an opinion that they do not believe that allowing financing to be used outside of the Tidelands Trust from a leasehold interest in the Tidelands Trust is consistent with the trust grant that the city holds the Tidelands Trust for in the first place. Now, the State's Lands Commission, as was pointed out to me by a number of the members of the working group, of course, is not the U.S. or the California Supreme Court. I guess I would say that the State Lands Commission is equivalent to the California Attorney General insofar as their opinions hold a lot of weight, but it doesn't mean that they get to say what the law is. But nevertheless, their whole purpose, starting in 1938, is to administer the trust grants that mostly include the Tidelands and to make sure that they're used for the trust grant purposes. So the conclusion reached in the legal opinion is that there is not clear state law to support relaxing the financing any further than what the current policy is proposing. I want to be clear that this is based upon a review of the public trust doctrine and what the Tidelands grant was to the city. So going back to the beginning of why this conclusion is reached, in 1960, before Morro Bay was a city, San Luis Obispo County received the final grant of state land, which is now the Tidelands. And that grant has a pretty specific list of uses that you can engage the Tidelands in, and otherwise you can't use it for those uses. In short, the Tidelands grant says that there needs to be commerce, navigation, or recreational purposes that benefit the entire people of the state. And it's very clear based upon that grant and also in further court cases that the uses have to be for the general public. They can't benefit private interests. That's the whole point of the Tidelands. They're basically the public's land being administered in trust by the state, and then the state gives it over to cities, and the city has it now, City of Morro Bay. So the core question raised by the group was in regards to the financing, why can't we use financing from our leasehold interests outside of the Tidelands? Well, that financing would have to be consistent with a benefit to the Tidelands. And it was proposed, and I wanted to make sure that my legal opinion, I think, covered all the issues. And I'd like to think I did a fair job of representing the working group's proposal. The idea basically that I heard was that it would continue to benefit the tidelands if this type of financing was allowed, because there would presumably be a greater net investment in the tidelands if you let some of the financing go outside of the tidelands. I'm not convinced that state law would agree with the speculation that allowing financing to go outside of the tidelands would definitely improve the tidelands over time. I suppose if council wanted to push the envelope, there could be some further review of how to come up with a policy where any financing that proposes to use tidelands leasehold interests to use that financing outside of the tidelands, I would suggest strongly that council would have to be convinced that that financing would net benefit the tidelands. But I think it's speculative to say that just in general, this would benefit the tidelands. And remember that the tidelands grant limits the uses of the tidelands. The law is clear on that. And we hold this land in trust from the state, and we're limited in what we can use it for. Commerce, navigation, and recreational purposes, but more importantly, for the benefit of the people of the state of California, not for private interests. Speaking to the Port of San Diego's policy, I can't address what their analysis was in allowing for their more relaxed financing. As Director Endersby related, we attempted to reach out to them a few times, and we weren't able to communicate with them on the reasoning behind it. I will point out that their financing standards are not just unrestricted. It makes it clear that if the money is not kept in the tidelands, that basically the port gets some of the money and or the rent would be increased to market rate or could be increased to market rate. Whether or not the Port of San Diego allows this doesn't mean that it's consistent with state law. And short of doing a review of all of the ports and tidelands trustees throughout the state, which the conclusion was is that we didn't want to spend too much time on all this review. The opinion from the city attorney's office is that the State Lands Commission's opinion is entitled to great deference. And I cannot find any clear authority in state law that would allow this lease site financing to go outside of the tidelands. Based upon, we have very limited authority in what we can use the tidelands for. It's a grant, it's a trust. And that grant, that trust is clearly laid out in language from 1960. And then there's just court cases and the State Lands Commission's interpretations of it since then. To be clear, there's no court case that definitively says you can't do this. So we're left with what's the State Lands Commission's advice, and is it seem reasonable that this financing proposal would benefit the tidelands? So I want to be clear that I crafted the legal opinion to not be a definitive document saying that it is absolutely unlawful, but I couldn't find support in state law to allow this. And the conclusion that I had in my legal opinion at the very end was that if we were to relax the financing further than what's being proposed, it would expose the city to claims the city is not adhering to the requirements of its Tidelands Grant Trust. I always wish that I could give a black or white answer, but I definitely think that this would expose the city to claims that were violating the Tidelands Trust. And whether or not one respects the State Lands Commission, they have been charged with administering these tidelands, and their opinion is clear. That letter is also in the staff report. So basically, there's exposure if the city were to relax the financing any further. And I can't find any clear state law provision that allows this. If the city wanted to go down that path, then I would definitely suggest that there be a robust discussion on how clearly does this benefit the tidelands and not the leaseholders themselves. Obviously, if the leaseholder could take the financing outside of the tidelands, that would be a benefit to their personal interests. But to be blunt, the Tidelands grant says that we must use the land for the public and not for private interests. So I hope that helps to clarify the city attorney's opinion on this. And I'm certainly can answer any questions council has about this specific issue. And this was a question that I took very seriously. I understand leaving out the language of the Tidelands grant from 1960, that there is a clear business argument for relaxing the financing policy even further. I won't deny that. But the city is definitely limited by the Tidelands grant. And the question is if the city wanted to do a more relaxed policy, is the city comfortable with potentially running afoul of that grant? The State Lands Commission thinks that it would. There isn't any clear court case on it that definitively says one way or the other.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody on the council have any questions? I mean, what we're looking for from council is concurrence to relax the policy, as Chris explained, to allow it anywhere on the Tidelands, not just to the lease site itself in question. And I guess the add-on to that would be, do you want to send us to do any further research or gather any information on whether we can look at Port of San Diego's example and see if we can get any headway there and relax this even further?
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Chris. Is that, are you ready for questions, Eric, or what?
Well, I got a couple more items. I'm done.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Yes, thanks.
Yep, so we'll move on from lease site financing. Perfect, Dana, you moved on just right. Next item in the conveyance letter from the group, item number 4, city control of future lease site development and redevelopment, as I touched on earlier. Recommendation from the Steves at Stafford and McCarty was for the city to be more in control. We definitely saw that. We wrote some more policy to convey that more distinctly and to put the city more in the driver's seat with regard to lease site development and redevelopment. Historically, as you know, for the most part, when leases have come up for expiration, if we're going with the existing leaseholder, we've typically asked what they want to do, or they've come with a proposal to us, and we say, yeah, okay, that looks good, let's go with that. We've not historically jumped in very much and said, no, we want this instead of that. We've just let them do what they want to do if we've gone to the existing leaseholder. Obviously, an RFP is a little different. That's puts out what the city wants, but we've not done a lot of RFPs. I think I've probably done more in my time than we've done in the last 20 years than my predecessors. So still learning about how to do that effectively. So historically, we've let the 10 decide, and our policy direction is clearly putting the city more in the driver's seat. The council agrees with this new policy direction. We'll need council guidance on how to implement it and to what degree the city should be in control. I'm not looking for that specific information tonight. It's really something that will probably be needed to brought to the fore and development of future lease site projects. It may be an opportunity to consider an overall lease management vision for the waterfront area. The city's general plan, local coastal program, and downtown waterfront master plans, all the planning documents that live up in community development are our primary documents for determining what the waterfront's going to look like. But they don't really include the lease site management aspect of it, and we need to find a good way to tie those two together. And this may be an opportunity to do that as we move forward with some of these lease site redevelopments. I think in my staff report, I said we've got, I want to say 8 or 9 potential lease sites coming up that fit in that category in the next 10 or so years that we're going to have to decide on what the direction we want to go on them is. So could be a good opportunity to do that. Okay, number 5. Dana, next slide. Financial auditing. So again, in my background, financial auditing increased, or more effective financial auditing was sort of what kicked this process off back in 2017-18, with the council wanting to get a little tighter on that and our maintenance of our lease site auditing. And then council expressed interest in that, and we wrapped it up into the overall lease policy update process. Our aim of financial auditing was to get some good policy and language that simplified it, made it more efficient and less costly for both the city and the tenant. When a tenant gets audited, depend on how complicated their lease site is. Obviously, a one-off like maybe Kayak Horizons might be fairly simple for that leaseholder to comply with an audit, but for a place like Marina Square Boatyard, where you've got double digits and subtenants and collecting all that data, it's a lot of effort for them as well. So our aim wasn't just to minimize the city's cost, but also for the tenants, and also to tap potential existing resources. What we kept falling back on that seemed like the best way to simplify the vast majority of our auditing needs would be to utilize the city's contracting with HDL companies, which is the company that does all our sales tax reporting and auditing and data gathering, and basically rely on what people are reporting to the state of California against what they report to us as their gross sales, in the very real belief, and I think true belief, that if they're going to try and jimmy the sales tax reporting to the state, that's a lot bigger hammer and a lot bigger consequences. But trust that they're reporting correctly to the state, and then use that data to convey against our data. That would take and other resources to tap into existing resources, which was more of a cost to the general fund, which obviously needs to get through the cost allocation somehow, but using the finance personnel to assist with that sales tax data comparison, because they're pretty much experts in how we get that stuff and when we get that stuff. So also we put, so there's sales, or there's revenues that are made on our lease sites that don't generate sales tax. Slip fees, for example, don't generate any sales tax. Services don't generate any sales tax. So we'd have to still do sort of traditional auditing on those. And in our updated policy, we've got those on a 3-year scale. And basically proposing to take about a third of the non-sales tax generating revenue sources and audit about a third of them every year, rolling them through a constant 3-year process. So we hit a third of them 1 year, a third of them the next, third of them the third year, and then we start back, kind of like repainting the Golden Gate Bridge. We get to one end and we start back on the other on a 3-year basis, and that would just be the non-sales tax type revenues. And then in the policy, we reserve the right to do a full audit on anybody, which is what our leases provide for at any rate. The leases don't say how often, when, or where we audit. It just says we reserve the right to audit at any time. And writing that in our policy just to make sure that it's clear that we always, if we see something that doesn't look right, we can always do a full audit. So seeking council's input and direction regarding the auditing process and the changes being proposed, and does that meet what the council was looking for? And also on the maintenance audit as well, maintenance type audits as well, maintaining lease sites. I haven't gone over every single item in the lease policy. I'm going to open this up here for some questions and see if the council wants to go to some specific areas. I don't think it's necessary to hit every single item in there, unless you really want to. I want to acknowledge the chamber. We had Erica Crawford on the group, and she provided a lot of great input, including input through the chamber and from her business members. And I acknowledge and appreciate their input. We touched on a lot of the issues they brought up in their letter of the relevant issues that they wanted to bring forward. Others were outside the scope of the policy group itself, so we didn't touch on them. But we acknowledged the hard work they did, and they've got a lot of good points. Dana, good, you went to a conclusion. So still a work in progress. We were working on all the exhibits as an ongoing process for a while, and then at some point we kind of abandoned those, realizing they were just taking up extra time and we wanted to get the policy done. There's a number of exhibits in there, from maps to lease forms to bubble charts, sort of flow charts, sort of if this then that, to guide people through buying a lease, redeveloping a lease, getting a sublease approved, those sorts of things. Those are still a work in progress. The new master lease template is really going to be the most important of our attachments. It's basically going to be what implements the lease policy through our lease policy terms. We've been working on that for piecemeal here and there through the process. We haven't gotten through it all. We had a subgroup. I think Bob and Joan were the two working on that. But the policy itself was number one, so we really concentrate on that. So we'll be bringing that back, hopefully with the final approval of the agreement. Again, I want to thank everybody on the working group that helped along the way. We did obviously in-person meetings about once a month. Sometimes we met twice a month until the whole coronavirus thing came along, and then we stopped for a little bit and then started meeting by conference call and by email and getting a lot of work done. So we did a fair amount of work, from March through now remotely and kept up, I think, our level of participation with everybody. So again, want to thank everybody that was on the group. Couldn't have done it without them. And hopefully we've got a good working policy to go forward with. Okay, I think I'm done talking for a minute. Questions?
Thank you, Eric. And I wanted to thank Ron and Joan for their comments as well. And personally wanted to thank the large working group that you have had for this past year and all of the work that they have put in. And you mentioned that, but I just wanted to add my thanks, especially to Marty Lamelli, who was your facilitator. And I know not only has a lot of expertise, but certainly has given a significant amount of his time with regard to helping move this process forward. So with that, what we'll do now is we did have a council subcommittee, Councilmember McPherson and Davis. When I come back after questions and public comment, I'll ask the two of you to open it up with your discussion. And then I'll begin now, though, with questions in general for any council members that have questions. And I'll start with Councilmember Heller, please.
Okay. I'm just totally impressed by the work this group has done. You guys are the best of the best in Morro Bay to put in the time that you did. And I'm real thoroughly impressed with the document. It's hard for me to find anything I don't like about it, which, if you know me, is unusual. The questions I have are, if the council wanted you to implement items 3 and 5, 3 being the lease site financing issue that's been thoroughly discussed, 5 is the financial auditing piece. Is there a cost associated with that, or could we implement that tomorrow?
Well, the lease site financing issue, I think it's going to take more research and trying to get back into Port of San Diego and other places to look at what they base their policy on. They're a huge port. All of their properties aren't within the Tidelands. I mean, they manage the airport there at San Diego. They manage a lot. Navy base, they got a lot of property. So my first question would be, is that policy specific to Tidelands or to other properties? And I think we really need, since they're the only ones we found, if we can somehow get their opinion. And maybe it has to be paying for their opinion. I don't know. Chris might have a better idea how this sort of thing works, interagency. I certainly didn't have much luck getting my foot in the door there. I got my foot in the door, but it's about as far as I got. So right now, probably not cost of staff, just staff time.
Yeah. So Eric, what I'm thinking about it in terms of this issue is, can we implement right away the use of funds in other areas of the Tidelands besides the specific lease site? That's what appeals to me. I mean, is there any reason we can't implement that right away?
I'm not sure I followed your question. Can you repeat?
Well, maybe I misunderstand this, but the issue of using funds from financing in the Tidelands area, but not on the specific leasehold site, is that something we can do right away, or is that more complicated than that?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So this is really strictly speaking to lending or loan proceeds that leaseholders are doing on their own lending for their lease sites. It's not something we're out doing and seeking funding for. So no, it's not a funding source we can go to. It's strictly leaseholders. Let's say Mark Tognazini wants to redevelop his lease site, take out a loan and using the lease site as collateral, which often our leaseholders do.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about apples and oranges here. What I'm trying to get at, maybe I misunderstand this completely. Maybe Chris, you can jump in on this, but it isn't part of this lease site financing issue, allowing the funds from a leasehold site to be used in the Tidelands area for general improvements, perhaps? Or
I believe, to answer your question, Councilman Heller, the current policy basically says don't even bother seeing if the city would approve financing unless it's used on that lease site. If tomorrow the city changes its policy to Now we will consider approving financing for uses anywhere in the Tidelands. That would just be a policy change, and then we'd have to wait for a proposal to show up.
Okay. Okay. So that's the issue.
I don't see there being much of an administrative cost or implementation issues with that policy change, because basically the next time refinancing comes before the city, there's more you could do with the money, and then all the other issues would be considered like they would have prior.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. The other question about the financial auditing is that something that would be difficult to implement or costly to implement at this point, Eric?
Well, most of the data we're going to be using would be from what we get from HDL that we get normally is our sales tax reporting. There's a little bit of a lag reporting that. We get our percent gross reporting at the end of the fiscal year. In other words, we get it in July. When the fiscal year ends, we get it in July, and that's when we start looking at it. And, that's when we start thinking about auditing it. So it would be, July, August, September, we'd be auditing it. It's staff time. It's additional potential staff time with the finance department, because it's not something they normally get involved in. So wouldn't be any direct cost, but there would definitely be some staff time costs with having finance assist us with getting that HDL data and comparing it to our data.
Okay.
And regular auditing, we've always hired CPAs to do, so there's always cost to that.
Right. Those are all the questions I have. I have a lot of comments, but I'm just going to stick to my questions for now, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you so much. Councilmember Addis, questions?
Yeah, I want to echo Councilmember Heller's accolades for the process and for the document. I think you have the right people in the room to make these decisions, and it's an incredibly impressive and thorough update to the policy. My only real question is there a way to walk the line to get a little more standardization on the formula for determining leases? I know that's been an ongoing conversation, and it's come up a lot of times, and I listened to all of the rationale for why that's hard to do and how, there's not a lot of models out there. But did the group look at, and I'm sure you did, sort of a combined approach where there would be, some flexibility, but some standardization in the way that you determine leases?
Well, that's a great point, Councilmember Addis. We looked at this a bunch of different angles. One of our primary concerns of going to any sort of a formulaic approach is, tying the council's hands and losing flexibility. As you know, for the leases you've been involved in, other council members that are involved in longer and other leases, they're a complicated negotiating process, and every leaseholder is different. Every site is different. One leaseholder may, put a importance on items A, B, and C. Another leaseholder may be D, E, and F, and that can completely change the flavor of what a lease looks like. While a formulaic approach would certainly simplify and take out any political or other, subjective bias that could change, over time, our concern was, tying the council's hands and not allowing for leasehold negotiating flexibility if the leaseholder is wanted to give on something different. In other words, if they wanted to agree to a higher rent, maybe the redevelopment didn't justify a 30-year lease, but they wanted 40. Well, maybe they'd agree to a higher rent after a certain number of years or something when they reach, sort of their maturity point on the leasehold, and maybe if paid loans off and whatnot, and it'd be more profit. So maybe they'd agree to a higher rent at that point. So things like that, you would lose some flexibility with. That was our concern. But no, I can't say we landed on any kind of a hybrid approach that could do both. I mean, a formula could certainly be part of a suite of issues that, sort of a buffet style that you could put on the table for negotiating a lease's term if we come up with a formula. The problem with San Diego is it was very one building oriented. It was a retail building's standard life is X years, a hotel is Y, a boatyard is Z, a restaurant is W, so they didn't really reflect a multi-use type buildings, but there's certainly valuation services out there that do that. I mean, there's companies that do valuations like this, so it'd be an extra cost. Not undoable, but it's just we don't have that in-house kind of capacity to do that. We'd have to be contracting out for that.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I appreciate it. That's really my main question, because I found this to be so well done and so thorough. So I very much appreciate all of the work, and Mr. Lamelli and the staff in the chamber and the group members, as well as our subcommittee. I can tell how much has gone into this process. And I want to express that I trust the process. I trust the people that were in the room for this process, and it makes it a lot easier to have a very complicated document come forward when we know that we've had the right people in the room to create it. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Davis, questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Eric, I am so impressed. You are famous for your comprehensive and well-written memos, and you have transferred that skill to this presentation. Bravo. And thank the committee that you put together for the hours that you spent working on this and the detail, and it's just great. So Marlis and I have sent you a boatload of questions over this past weekend, and you were gracious enough to answer them all via email, and you have incorporated most of those answers into tonight's presentation. So you have not left us much to ask about tonight. A couple of things I'd like to seek some clarification on. You had a brief conversation with Steve McCarty and Steve Davis about trying to get some ideas about professional property management, which you didn't get a good answer. But my question is, if we contracted the property manager to a professional, would we be able to reduce harbor staff at any level by outsourcing that?
That's a great question. So right now, we're one full-time staffer down. Remember, we had Charlie Lowe as our administrative tech, who replaced Polly when she retired as our front office coordinator and routine paperwork administrative duties. And then Lori's my business coordinator that gets into the weeds and gets in deep with me with leases and financial stuff. Charlie moved on to rec department. We had a part-time person move from rec to help us out, and she left for another job. And then we went without, and now Corona hit. And so, we're down a full-time staffer right now. So could we reduce staffing anymore right now? No, I don't think so. I think if we were to hire out some sort of a firm to help us out, I think what that does is it relieves myself and Lori of a fair amount of those duties that we can then refocus back on the other issues that our staffer that we don't have anymore was doing, and other stuff, because we're running pretty thin in a lot of duties right now on personnel. So I don't think it'd be any reduction in people. It's just going to be a refocus of effort within the department and existing staffing.
Okay. The chamber recommended using a fixed percentage rate of appraisal value versus a monthly rate plus a percentage of gross sales. Do you have any numbers to compare between those two approaches as to which provides the greater revenue to the city?
It's funny you asked that. I just happened to, yes. So yes, and I'll just do a quick rundown of how it works. So we have minimum rents or base rents, they're kind of interchangeable term, that are that are based on one of two things, either 8% of the appraised value of the property or 75% of the last 5 years total rent received from the lease site. In other words, if 8%, and then it's the higher of. So if the 8% of the appraised value of the property results in let's say a $30,000 rent, but 75% of the last 5 year total revenues received method, percent gross revenues received and minimum rent revenues received amounts to 150,000, we go with 150,000. And it really reflects what's the more lucrative method of getting rent. In other words, when a lease site does well and makes a lot of money, the city makes more money. And if the lease site, the economy goes down and the lease site makes less, the city makes less. So it kind of ties the leaseholder and the city together in that regard. Is more to deal with, I think, is one of the things the chamber brought up. But it tends to tie the city more to the economy and tie the leaseholder to the economy. I crunched numbers in 2018-19, which is the last year we have total revenue data from, because we don't have the percent gross in from 1920, and I wouldn't want to use this year anyhow because of Corona is going to kill it. We've got, of our total appraised values right now, our total appraised value on the waterfront, I think the chamber used this number and it's pretty accurate. It's a little high, but not enough to worry about. $12 million. If you take 8% of $12 million, it's $960,000. In 2018-19, our total rent received was $1,620,000. Trying to make it round to make it easy. So at 8%, $960,000 versus $1,620,000, we're losing money. At 10%, of that appraised value, if we took a flat 10%, which some agencies do, so I think the city of Santa Barbara, a lot of their leases on a flat 10% rent, we'd receive $1,200,000, still a little bit lower than $1,619,000. If you do the formulaic method and do the reverse math, if I paid attention close enough in algebra, we'd need to charge on everybody 13.5% of their appraised value on every lease site to make up that $1,619,000 total rent we received in 2018-19. So 14% to basically break even on a flat rent basis.
Okay. And then my last question. The Waterfront Master Plan was adopted by the council in 1996. And I was very impressed with that the vision that it presents is still viable today. But many of the objectives of that plan have been met. And I wonder how you or the committee feel about updating that plan using today's conditions and market opportunities.
So correct me if I'm wrong, either Scott Graham or Scott Collins, we're in the middle. We're updating the downtown and waterfront master plan, correct?
Well, the waterfront master plan, the concept is that it's one of the implementation items of the draft general plan. So the idea will be once we adopt the general plan, then one of the go-do items in there is to update the waterfront master plan.
So that's a follow-on item to the GPLCP update. I don't know if that answers your question, Councilmember Davis, but
yeah. Yes.
And like I spoke earlier, I think one of our follow-on activities for this process could be, or maybe should be, and that's what I had touched on earlier, is once that update is done, then we look at our lease policy and make sure that it's really, jiving together good with it.
Right, and that's what I see as the methodology by which the city takes more control over development of the waterfront. So that's why I asked that question. Thank you. That's all my questions, and I look forward to the council comments.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. Councilmember McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Questions? Thank you.
Well, I do have a few, but let me first be the last one, or to thank the working group. I can't tell them how much I appreciate the time and the effort that they put in. And I have spoken with several members of the group in preparation for this meeting, so I know about all the research that they did. And I also heard that they worked well together, and I just really appreciate all of the time and effort that they put in, and especially Marty Lamelli, who I first suggested that he might be approached, so I felt responsible when it went on so long, but I sure appreciate all that he did. Also, the Chamber, they're looking at the draft and providing some very good ideas. And you know, even though Councilmember Davis and I were at the subcommittee, we did not attend any of the meetings of the group. So, you know, we have shared our thoughts together, and we have asked questions at which Eric was gracious enough to answer. So let me just ask a couple more that came to me while I was listening to the presentation. Can you tell me, Eric, how many Thailand lease sites you manage? How many are there?
We have 30 total, and in those 30, there's about 90 individual businesses represented.
Okay, so how much time do you think it would take to actually do the site visits and the auditing that you're proposing? And would you envision your staff doing most of that? And I'm talking about the auditing and the site visits.
Well, you talk about financial auditing or physical auditing?
Both.
So we haven't gone in to try to estimate, you know, what sort of time it may have to put into it. As I spoke on the financial audit part, you know, the majority of it that that's a subject to sales tax. We do that on an ongoing basis every year. And I think overall, and that catches, you know, the majority of our sales. The majority of the revenues, I think doing it on an ongoing basis, taking it in smaller chunks rather than every 3 years or 5 years, you know, trying to grab a big chunk. I don't think we've ever, looking back on our files, we've never audited every single lease site on the waterfront in any given year. We've always just taken a few over the years. So I think it would, in the long run, cut down on our time, because we'd be just going into sales tax data and using it, which is already available and pretty simple. Having not yet done it yet, but having, you know, done our audits, the last ones we did back in 2013-14, you know, the sales tax data isn't always perfectly clear, because some people have businesses with 2 locations and there's some complications to get through it. But I think in the long term it would cut down on our time, but we haven't gone in and estimated on what it might be, because we still have to contract out, you know, the regular CPA type audits on the other ones. The lease maintenance type auditing, you know, we're proposing in the policy, I'm flipping through it here. It's on page 77 of the agenda packet. It's item N for Nancy in the document. We're proposing to use a multitude of different folks here, some of which are already, you know, somewhat involved with lease site monitoring, and some are not. What we're proposing is a combination of using harbor staff, the fire marshal, who does do business inspections pretty regularly, our code enforcement folks, or folk, I should say, at this point, and other resources, private contractors or building inspectors if needed, but trying to do largely in-house with our code enforcement and building inspector and fire marshal and harbor department experts on that, and utilize them. So like the financial auditing, that would be some more potential burden on the general fund folks. Fire marshal already does and is obligated to do building inspections, you know, throughout the town. So I don't see that it add much to that person's workload, but the building inspector and code enforcement folks, they're not normally out at lease sites checking on stuff unless they got a report of something. So it'd be some additional time and cost, but haven't gone in and tried to estimate what those times and costs may be at this point.
Okay, is that something that you would be doing next in terms of coming up with an implementation plan? Policy. So you would really need to be more specific about who would be doing what and
Yes, I think exactly. Implementation, as I spoke earlier, and implementation and successful execution of that is going to be key. And how we're, some things are going to be fairly simple in the policy to implement. Some are going to be more complicated. That's going to be one of them. So that would be part of our implementation plan and working that forward, and then work with the folks up the hill in City Hall and community development on how much they can get involved. And again, obviously we're not just going to ask the general fund to start giving us services for free. It's going to be a cost allocation issue to some extent. So we'd have to work those issues out.
Okay. And I know that the current policy suggests that we are reevaluating fair market value every 5 years, but does that actually happen? And who does that? The reevaluation or the reappraisal of fair market value?
We do, yes. Almost every lease, I shouldn't say ever, there's still a couple outliers out there, but the vast majority of our leases say the lease site value will be reappraised and the minimum rent or base rent reset every 5 years. And so right now, Lori's getting ready to ship that list up to our that does that. We had a firm, it was Reeder and Gilman down in Santa Maria, and Les Gilman, who was the sole operator there, passed away a couple of years ago. And so we found another firm that basically took over his files. And so we turn that over. We usually have 3 to 5 appraisals a year, roughly. And then they'll go and reappraise the value and then look at the last 5 years total rent, do the cost comparison, and we end up with what their appraised values are, and we go from there. So yes, we are doing those. We always keep up with those. And then there's the annual CPI calculators that we keep up on every year as well.
Okay. And then I have a couple questions, I think, for Chris, related to this whole issue of financing, refinancing. I know that it's been a contentious issue, and that obviously people feel strongly on both sides of this. Would we gain anything by doing any more legal research, in your opinion?
I don't think that there's more legal research to do. I suppose the city could contact more ports. There were a few ports, as Eric pointed out, that members of the working group had said, well, look what they're doing. I suppose it might be worthwhile if council wanted to review this issue more thoroughly to see what the average port does. That would certainly take some time. But in terms of the law, I don't think there's more research to do, if that answers your main question.
It does. It does. And do you think there's a difference between the initial financing for improvements, which clearly you would expect would be spent on the lease site, and refinancing, where, as I understand it, there may be some leaseholders who actually can afford to do the initial improvements, and then would like to use that as collateral on a loan so that they can do another development elsewhere. Is there a difference at all between initial financing and refinancing?
Well, yes, insofar as if the financing is to be used for development outside of the tidelands, there is not clear support in state law for that. And the State Lands Commission's opinion is that is contrary to our grant, the trust grant. So it's not the financing mechanism that is in question. It's what the financing is used for.
Okay. All right. That's all my questions. Thank you, Chris. And I think, except for perhaps one last question for Eric, and I think I asked this already, but others may be interested in the answer. Would this lease policy in any way affect current lease holders, or is it primarily to be used for future leases?
Good question. Great question. We are contractually obligated with all of our leaseholders on whatever their lease is. So we can't implement any policy that goes against their existing terms. And I don't think we have. I mean, we took effort to make sure we didn't. There is, on the issue of common area maintenance, one of our recommendations or one of our policy items in the document is having leaseholders be held responsible for common public areas or other areas that aren't necessarily on their physical lease sites that they use. And the example we used was, the pathway that they use to push their dumpster out into the street. That can put some wear and tear on the sidewalk or the street. Or if they've got leaky food stuff that leaks, sometimes you see that kind of black streak on the ground. That sort of thing. If they're affecting other public or common or not on their lease site areas with their lease site operations, they need to be held accountable for that because they're using those areas and affecting them. So there's some things like that are kind of in between, but no, we couldn't implement anything that goes flat out against lease policy. And if you read the document closely enough, you'll find several areas where in the lease auditing, for example, the language says, we're going to do this, but also subject to the terms and conditions in the individual leases. So we can't go against those, but our future lease management through the lease document itself, if we are taking some course corrections that we would definitively write into new leases as opposed to where there's really nothing in the leases now in some of those areas.
Okay, so how does the council, if a new council decides to make new policy decisions related to the leases, there is no way to put in the policy itself a statement that any new policy changes will apply to existing leases? Is that illegal?
I'm going to phone a friend, my city attorney, Mr. Newmeyer, and since you're starting to get into the legal world, Chris?
So any agreement that the city has entered into with, a private party, whether it's a lease, a contract, whatever, we can't just unilaterally amend that without their consent. So we can't wholesale change the policy tomorrow and have that impact, everything. We entered into contracts, and those contracts are protected by law. Those leases are protected by law. In regards to different aspects of what to do when leases come up for renewal, what to do with lease site financing, where to get money to support, the district and the harbor, that all is subject to change, of course. If that answers your question.
It does. It does. Thank you. Those are all my questions, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Very good questions. And Eric, thanks again to everybody for the presentation. I do have a few additional questions. So let me start out with this. In your opinion, Eric, how has the city in the past 5 years gone about the process of identifying the assets that the city might want to or would desire to see built on the Embarcadero? How have we gone about that with regard to the existing waterfront master plan and or any documents that have established a vision for the harbor in general? Has there been a uniform mechanism? I know it's kind of a complex question. Is there any uniform mechanism right now that exists, or does it, in your mind, feel piecemealed in a sense? And I'm not no conjecture with regards to blame or anything like that. Just trying to get your sense of how it's happened.
I appreciate that. No, I've never claimed to be the do-all, be-all property manager of the Morro Bay's waterfront, and we've never, we're doing everything perfectly in the greatest way possible. We're definitely doing the best we can, and I think we've done a good job. And sure, there's some room for improvement. My answer to that would probably be it's been more piecemeal and organic. In general, when a leaseholder is like I said earlier, we've not, up until fairly recently, we've not done a lot of RFPs. I think we did one on the old Whale's Tail restaurant, which is now House of Juju. And I think we might have done one on the old 8788, which was off the hook where TLC is now quite a while ago. So we've not done a lot of RFPs. We've mostly gone to the existing leaseholder, and when that process occurs, and the leaseholder's got a plan, we've usually marched up the hill to community development. I think we've done a better job in recent years with that. I think in past years we've not done that, and it was kind of isolated. We'd go a certain distance with the leaseholder down here, and then go up the hill and try and move a plan forward, and it didn't always work. And I think we've done a lot better in recent 3, 4, 5, 6 years with our existing management structure. And so we'll go up the hill and talk to community development and city manager, and make sure that it's something that's doable and viable and fits within the WMP box, and then make sure the leaseholder, obviously they've got to apply for the project and the plans. And then, as you know, we bring it to the council and bring the concept to the council and get a consent to landowner approval eventually, and then they're off to the races. So, but it's not been a what I'd say a systematic or any kind of a formulaic approach where we've okay, here's the things we're going to do, here's where we're going to go, and here's where we're going to talk to. It's been more piecemeal is probably the simplest way to put it.
Okay, thanks. I had the pleasure of sitting down with you maybe 6 or 7 months ago when I inquired about your sense of major capital needs for the harbor over the next 5 or so years. And you went over a document with me that identified, in my recollection, a significant number of capital improvement needs. Do you recall on an annual basis about how much that, or what was the magnitude of the capital improvement needs that are currently not being funded through any viable mechanism that continue to pile up year after year? Any sense of the magnitude of that?
Yeah, without jumping into my files, that was basically our list of capital projects and issues. That's everything from our commercial fishing boat slips to the T-piers to the little end docks that nobody rents, our harbor office, all the stuff we spend money on. The number at this point is I think over the next 10 years, if we were to, so what I identified was my estimated cost to deal with things on an annual basis. In other words, big ticket items we need to spend, say a major electrical upgrade to the slips occasionally, and then replace those slips. If you amortize those over time and look at the next 10 years, I believe that number was about $6 million worth of infrastructure needs over the next 10 years. And obviously you divide 6 million by 10, it's a pretty big number. And so
currently, do you have a capital budget that allows for that kind of funding?
No, not at all. We'd have to, if that was in the ideal world, if money were no object, we'd spend $600,000 a year on this kind of stuff for the next 10 years. No, we're, as you know, we're very thin on money and doing our slips and pier maintenance and other things.
Right. So is it a fair statement to say that right now the harbor enterprise is, for the most part or almost all, being funded by leases or leasehold interests?
Yeah, the vast majority. Those numbers I gave you earlier, 1,600,000 in 2018, 620,000 out of roughly a $2 million budget. 18-19 is a little lower, so you've got roughly 400,000 coming from all the other sources, and 1,600,000 coming from the leases. So it's pretty simple to see where the vast majority is coming from.
In your opinion, is there any way that one could assume that the leasehold interests could adequately fund both your operating and capital budget to meet your current and future needs?
Not the current and future capital needs to any significant extent. No, we're just, in the years past, yes. When I started in this position, I forget exactly what we had in our accumulation fund. But we did a pretty major North T-pier project and a couple other pretty significant projects, and we're down to Jennifer Callaway can jump in, but I think we're down to somewhere around $400,000 in our accumulation fund now. It's it's withered down, and in the economic recession of 2008 didn't help. Obviously, we had to go backwards a little bit, and then the losing $275,000 from the outfall lease of a $2 million budget, that was a big hit. Then you tap all the PERS stuff on top. I mean, in 15, 20 years ago, we were doing okay. We were able to do, the launch ramp slips and the Beach Street slips were replaced early in my tenure here in the early 90s when I started. And so we had some more funding back then, but I think costs were a lot less. And we had some other revenue sources that did a little better with the outfall lease and some others. And so we had put some money in the bank, but, all told now, recession, outfall lease, all the PERS issues and all those costs, and it's just been a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 punch, and it's just knocked us to the ground.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is it ever going to be possible to assume that the leasehold interests that we have are going to fully fund the needs of your department?
No, I don't think so. Not without
and allowing the businesses to remain viable.
No, as Ron spoke, we need additional revenue or augmented revenue sources to make that happen.
Great. Councilmember McPherson asked about, I think you answered her question about financial audits, but can you tell me how you routinely evaluate the physical improvements and or the physical appropriateness of the improved assets for the leases we hold?
Admittedly, we don't have a great program or process to do that. It's usually been like much of our code enforcement stuff on report or on condition. We find out something, we hear from somebody or one of our officers or somebody out in the field sees something and we follow up on it. Typically things like that. We've not had a good program, and I don't think we've ever had a good program, even going back 20 years to really maintain and keep up on our lease sites. We've relied on our leaseholders to ensure they maintained it, because obviously the premise is, and I think it's true, but it doesn't always happen in every case. It's in their best interest to maintain their site to make the maximum amount of revenue, because a rundown site is going to potentially learn less revenue, but that's not always worked out.
Okay, fair. In your heart of hearts, tough question. Do you really feel that with regard to this new lease policy, if it were adopted, that you have the internal resources and attributes necessary to fully implement and manage it? Or would we be looking at the potential for outsourcing the lease management as an alternative to help supplement your staffing and or your needs, or adding more staff to be able to actually implement the plan itself?
Boy, in my heart of hearts.
Sorry about that.
No, I don't think we do currently with current staffing. Primarily because as I spoke earlier, we're down one as it is. We'd have to really look at our service model and see where we could, what things we could drop, and it'd be tough because a lot of our costs goes into the harbor patrol, goes into the public safety aspect, and they're not really involved in lease management much. A little bit, my patrol supervisor is a little, and they help a little bit, but they're not, holistically involved. So it would be tough with existing staffing and expertise. Like I said, I think, we were looking at a business manager model that obviously has a significant cost to it. And I think we're kind of at a crossroads right now with being at the staffing levels we're at to really look at our department and how we're going to move forward into the future, both, even outside this lease policy, where we are with things and with costs the way they are. And now the coronavirus just adding to our woes. It's a good time to look at our longer term strategy and how we're going to do this, and whether it's in-house, out-of-house, however, we need to look at what those costs are and how we're going to factor that in.
Okay, and then just a couple more questions. How does this new proposed policy differ from our existing lease policy with regard to the financial vetting of those that are applying for either the RFPs or to be lessees of the city. Have we changed the financial vetting parameters and or process with regard to determining viability?
Yes, we've definitely added to the factors and to the sort of issues we look at when we're looking at financial partners. I'm just thumbing through the existing policy because I don't think we have a section in it that specifically addresses that as much as we do now. We talk about standards for determining whether we should negotiate a new lease with a tenant, and it touches on some of the things that are in our new policy. Our existing assignment and assumption application documents and sublease documents go into a little bit of financial vetting type issues, but they're not really policy type issues. So I think to answer your question, our new policy goes into much more detail and has, I think, a lot more sort of criteria that are looked at when we're looking at financial partners than what the old policy had.
Okay. And last question, on page 58 of the staff report on your conclusion, with regard to the master lease template, which it says is perhaps the most important of the exhibits as it will engender the policy itself by implementing the policy through lease terms. When can we assume that we'll be able to see that, or when will that come forward?
Oh man, you're gonna make me make another estimate on time?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to hold you accountable.
I'm hoping. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a lot of drastic changes to it. it's the term I've used on the existing template is it's been Joe-ized, meaning Joe Pannone, our former city attorney, who's now still working contract with the firm doing lease stuff. When he came on, the first lease we did was based on an existing, basically the last one we approved, and then he went through it and put all his changes in it. And then everyone that's come through since then, he's continued to do that. So it's pretty up to date in terms of legal wording and whatnot on the existing model.
Just looking for a time, possibly.
Yeah, sorry, you know me. I guess what I was trying to go is I'm hopeful we can bring it back with the final policy approval, depending on how much direction we get from you all tonight on the final policy. We picked away at it in the group, and then at some point we stopped just because we want to get the policy done. So that's my hope. I guess I should have gone straight to the answer.
That's fair. Thanks so much. With that, Zeke, I'll open it up to public comment. Do we have anybody in the queue for public comment on item C-1?
There are people in the queue, but nobody has their hand up.
Okay, I'll wait a minute. I am opening public comment for item C-1, and I'll just wait a sec. See if we have anybody interested.
Yes, we do have somebody.
All right, great.
All right, Therese.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, it's Sharice Hansen. I was on the lease policy group.
Welcome, Sharice.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Honorable Mayor and council members. I am going to talk a little bit of like a pre-part of, because I thought I was going to go on the beginning. But anyway, so my name is Sharice Hansen. I'm on the Harbor Advisory Board as one of the tenants on the TTL properties. I own Under the Sea Gallery, TLC Family Enterprises, which is, so now I'm a master leaseholder as well, year and a half ago. My interest As far as the HAB and this particular situation has always been a sustainable community. So even if you look at me from the perspective of a subtenant or a master leaseholder or a mom, I'm still going to always be somebody who tries to work towards a sustainable community. So a little bit about what we did. So this is my part, is that at the very beginning, we started with a lot of research. So I feel like we spent about a good 6 months collecting raw data in an unbiased pursuit of the facts, kind of a scientific approach. And we looked at a range of areas on the Pacific and farther, but pretty much similar coastal towns. I and everybody on board spoke to numerous types of entities managing properties, such as like harbor departments, city governments, ports, property management companies. That's something that I'd be interested in being a part of in future when you guys start talking about property management being a possible thing, a route to go to instead of the harbor department managing the lease sites anymore. I do want to give some kudos to our member chamber CEO, Erica Crawford. She was in her element as far as the collecting of the data. Everybody throughout the entire process was a really great addition, but she collected a lot of data, and with her connections and masterful internet skills, she got us a lot of the concrete numbers that helped as far as getting all of our comparison tables, especially a really big question that the council had, which was the percentage of the Embarcadero TTL properties in Morro Bay, is it similar to surrounding areas? And I'm glad that we really got a full spectrum of numbers on that. And we looked at it from ground leases and improvements and all, and situations where it was a nonprofit. So we really looked into that in great detail to get a really good, accurate number table. And I personally enjoyed speaking to and visiting quite a few of the ocean towns with like properties. In some cases, I even pursued things as a possible subtenant. So I really got the actual data. Then we spent another 6 months breaking down each item on lease policy, looking at all elements inside, outside, around, and through, really getting into the purpose of the policies, which was probably my favorite part. Thinking about the policy in action and how the best outcome could be reached by all the parties in the most efficient way. I really considered possible outcomes, both positive and negative, any alterations to current policy. Kudos to Bob Fowler for his personal experience and connections with other working coastal properties. And I got to realize how old Eric, our harbor master Endersby, is by his great Morro Bay history knowledge in that knock on wood head of his. He knows this harbor, its people.
Charisse, sorry to interrupt you, but Charisse, it's a 3-minute public comment. Just need to have you wrap it up. It's 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. And then finally, the editing portion of the document was a laborious task, of which Chairman Ron Reisner, HAB Chairman Ron Reisner was great at, and Joan Sulu, great editor, organizer. And all of the members were a pleasure to work with, and especially stay on topic, Marty Lamelli and Lori Stiltz. They are now my office buddies, and I wish that soon, after this COVID crisis is better understood and manageable, to hang around the water cooler once more.
Thank you so much, Charisse. You bet. Thank you. Thanks for your involvement. Appreciate it. Zeke, do we have another hand up?
No, sir. There are no more hands up.
Okay, I'll just wait a second. The instructions are on the screen. Anybody would like to raise your hand and offer public comment that hasn't offered public comment yet? I'll just wait a minute. Hearing none, seeing none, I will close public comment and bring it back to council. And this is discussion. I will ask either Council Member McPherson or Davis if you'd like to open up for us. And thank you for your service as being the subcommittee appointed to oversee and be part of this process. We appreciate that. And I'll let you go ahead with your summary. Whoever wants to go first.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Councilman Davis. First, it is obvious that the harbor funding mechanism is broken. The TTL revenues and the user fees are not keeping up with what we need to operate, maintain, repair, and replace harbor facilities. But that's a matter for a larger discussion. Tonight, we're looking at the lease management policy. So I'd like to just give some of my thoughts for staff. We need to continue to reappraise the fair market value of the properties and adjust the rents accordingly on a fixed schedule. We need to stay on top of cost allocations for user fees for the slips, the docks, the moorings, and ensure that users pay for the full cost of operations, maintenance, and replacement. And I would suggest establishing separate fund accounts for the various facility types so that we can provide transparency to users and show them where the money comes from and how it's being spent. I agree with the committee's recommendation that staff should investigate the cost and the benefits of engaging a professional property manager to manage the leases. This would relieve Eric of a significant responsibility that is not part of his job description. And I think it would also make negotiations for lease renewals more objective. I would also like to find out how professional property management would interface with the periodic financial audits that we perform. I like strengthening the audits to make sure that we get a true picture of sales and appropriate revenue. One of the major things the committee looked at was refinancing leasehold interest with the intention of allowing loan proceeds for other than leasehold purposes. I would support a policy that is being proposed to allow for leasehold loan proceeds to be used for development purposes on any of our Tidelands Trust lease waterfront properties, but not expanding beyond that. The Chamber wrote a lengthy and thoughtful analysis of harbor operations that I appreciate very much, and I want to talk about some of those. The Chamber recommends looking at paid parking, and I know staff presented that as a possible revenue augmentation, but with the caveat that typically the proceeds from paid parking pay for no more than enforcement or perhaps some maintenance of parking lots. However, the Chamber says that Pismo Beach generates an annual profit of $400,000 by charging for parking. So if that's an opportunity that we're missing, we should look at it more closely. The Chamber also recommends developing a long-range business plan for the entire waterfront area, and I absolutely agree that we should do that. And what they said is that much of the waterfront area is in fact a large shopping and commercial district and should be managed as such. And the city should also establish a financing mechanism so that non-Tidelands lease properties pay an equitable share of waterfront areas maintenance and operations. They suggest a business improvement district, and that's fine if there is a champion who will pursue establishment of a BID. However, that's strictly a business decision that is made by business and property owners. So I would ask the Chamber to take the lead to see if there is a a hunger for a business improvement district among our waterfront properties. And I would ask city staff to support the formation of a BID with appropriate information and business-friendly regulation. Another possibility that they suggested would be establishing a harbor district, and that's something that we should probably look at as well. The chamber did recommend converting to fixed rate rents based on property appraisal rather than a mix of fixed rate plus a percentage portion of sales. I think Eric's made a good case for continuing with the system that he has in place now. A percentage of taxable sales that creates a partnership where both parties have a stake in making the harbor a desirable visitor-serving asset. And it motivates everyone involved to raise their game in attracting tourists to come and spend money. And it also is producing greater revenue to the city than a fixed rate would. There are some rent comparables that the committee produced between Morro Bay and other California ports. And there are 3 areas where I think we could raise our percentages. For restaurant food service, Morro Bay charges 3%, and the statewide average is 4.95%. And then for hotels and motels, Morro Bay charges 5%, and the average state rate is between 8 and 9%. I agree also that the city should take more control over waterfront development. The waterfront master plan will be looked at after the general plan is adopted. The current plan is great. The vision that it presents is one that we are still pursuing. And in fact, we have adopted many of the recommendations that are in that plan. One of the things I would look for in future planning is more activity-oriented facilities, especially family-oriented activities. And some examples of that are miniature golf, roller skating, bowling. Bill Shuchuk used to promote the idea of bringing in a portable ice skating rink. So those are just some ideas that I have for meaningful waterfront activities. So that's it for me. And again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, committee. Thank you, Marlis.
Thank you, Councilmember Davis. Very comprehensive, and appreciate you addressing, I believe, almost all of the questions that were asked by staff that we need to comment on. Councilmember McPherson, the other part of the dynamic duo.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And first, let me mention that Red and I had an opportunity to exchange our thoughts. And so I said, I fully agree with everything you said. So why don't you go first? Because then I can just say I agree with my fellow subcommittee member. But let me just make a few. So I'm not going to say anything about some of the, we know that the Harbor Fund needs more revenues, and we know that Eric is already wearing too many hats. So, and we know we need to get more money. So I'm not going to address those issues. I'm really going to just address the issues that they asked for comments on. But let me just begin by saying that I think this draft harbor lease policy is an excellent foundation for moving forward. It is such a significant improvement over the existing harbor lease policy. And the research completed by the group demonstrates that this policy is in line with other title and trust sites. So that's my overall comment. Here's some specific recommendations that were requested from Eric. I definitely think we should contract out some aspect of property management to a consultant, a real estate firm. I don't know exactly how much of the function. I think I would leave it up to Eric to decide what he thinks his staff can adequately handle and what should perhaps be in a contract. But I do think it should be somebody. I don't believe we should be hiring people at this point in time. I think it needs to be a a firm that has experience in negotiating leases and perhaps other aspects of the lease management function that he doesn't believe that he and his staff have the time to handle. So that's my first recommendation. I wouldn't want to come back and see a comparison of the two models. Rather, what would you contract out and what would you want to do yourself? With respect to a formula for determining lease length, I understand the working group's rationale for maintaining flexibility during negotiations, but I agree with Councilmember Addis that it would be nice to see a little bit more specificity. And perhaps that could be in the form of ranges of, if you invest X amount, it's worth approximately some percent of the lifetime of the building, or some, just a range, or some explanation. Perhaps we could require an explanation of how the final proposed lease term considered all of the various factors involved. So if there's any way to think about that and come up with something, I would appreciate it. I was originally going to ask that our city attorney do more research on the issue of financing, refinancing, but after listening tonight, I believe that I would concur with Mr. Davis's comment that we should accept the policy recommendations in the current draft with respect to lease financing and refinancing. Regarding more city control over future lease site development and redevelopment, yes, the city needs to have more control. And I would like to see some suggestions for doing that. I think revisiting the vision is absolutely necessary. The waterfront master plan, which I actually looked at and read for the first time and in preparation for this. So I think that there's an opportunities coming up for some lease consolidations. We need to take that into account, and we really do need to take into account what we would like to see on the Embarcadero. Regarding financial auditing, I concur with the recommendations made by the working group in the draft document. And again, I concur with Mr. Davis that we should continue the same method of assessing rents, so a base rent plus a percentage, and not accept the chamber's recommendation to go with base rent. I would recommend a couple of changes to the policy document itself, and one is specifically under the financial criteria and financial financing considerations. And the language in the document states the city may use any or all of the following criteria, and then it goes on to list 5. Well, all of these are important, and I would change that. I would not say any, I would say, which could mean one of the criteria. All of them should be taken into consideration when making a decision. I just think the current wording is too lax. The next phase of lease policy development, fleshing out the exhibits, especially the master lease template, will be critical. And I'm wondering if the working group or perhaps the subcommittee that was working on it might continue to work with Eric in preparing these. And maybe the staff could explore that recommendation to see if they might be willing to do that. I think that's all of my comments. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for your participation as a subcommittee in the process. Councilmember Heller, comments, sir.
Okay. You know, in the Westerns I used to watch as a kid, when something bad would happen in town, the sheriff would go out and he'd deputize a whole bunch of citizens, and they'd get a posse and they'd run off and they'd catch the bad guy. And this working group reminds me of a group of people I would like to deputize. They've done an outstanding job on this. It's so solid. The research, the time you put in, the fact that you still get along and you like each other, it's almost like a miracle. I think we need to deputize this group to deal with what's really front and center right now, which is the pending blight on the waterfront that we're so concerned about. We're not in a position where we have the revenues to implement this entire policy. I think it's a great policy. I agree with Ron Reisner that the waterfront, as it's currently being operated and has operated for years, is not sustainable. We need a dependable revenue source that will physically improve it and sustain it. I believe the way the Embarcadero goes is how Morro Bay will go. And I don't know if the working group wants to continue on, but I think you've done a great job here. Let's set that aside and really focus on how you can help us with the financial blight that many of us think is going to happen fairly quickly at the Embarcadero. I am big on volunteers. I would like to see the auditing, the city take control of a couple of components of this plan, one of which would be auditing. Maybe the working group could step up and do that or assist staff with that. And maintenance of the facilities. Most things that I see when I walk around down there are, well, the sidewalk's not cleaned or this hasn't been done. I'm not talking about major maintenance things. We need to step up right away and find a way to maintain this Embarcadero so it just looks better without spending a lot of money, because we don't have a lot of money. Maybe the working group would want to take that on and help with that. How about Morro Bay Beautiful helping with that? There's so much we can do right now without the revenue. The revenue is so key. I think we need a sustainable source. Mayor Heading has talked about it. It's absolutely necessary for this to be a sustainable waterfront. We are a grape versus watermelons, and the scale of the Embarcadero is not sufficient to be self-supporting. In some ways, it's a lost leader right now. We cannot afford lost leaders. We want people to be begging for these spaces. And if the city needs to subsidize the Embarcadero, so be it. But we really need to pay attention to a new revenue source that will sustain it, a new business model. I don't think parking is going to be enough. And I think we need to find ways that volunteers can implement auditing and dealing with the maintenance issues right now and potential blight and how we're going to manage that in the next 4-6 months or perhaps longer. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Heller. Appreciate the comment. Councilmember Addis.
Hi. Sorry, trying to get my computer back on.
Why does the sun never go down where you are on? The sun never seems to set.
Well, it's sunset. It's sunset behind me now. Okay. But sorry. I'm sorry. I don't mean to hold us up here. Trying to get these things back up in front of me real quick. But I wanted to start by saying that I am supportive of exploring having a management, some kind of other management company or, take a look and have oversight, but that I would like to keep it under the purview or under the umbrella of the Harbor Department. I will reiterate my desire to have some sort of standardization. I feel like part of how we've gotten into this wonky place with the harbor is because we've sort of relied on history for determining leases. And if we continue to do things the way that we've always done them, then we likely aren't going to get different results. And so it's important for us to be thinking about, while we want council to maintain a high degree of flexibility with what we're doing, the way that councils have handled this in the past and the way that the harbor has been handled in the past has gotten us to a certain place that I don't think any of us want to be. And so it's time to approach it a little bit differently, even if that means baby steps towards a little bit more standardization. And I agree with Councilmember McPherson in terms of at least having some rationale. I do, agree with leaseholders being able to leverage their leases for security for other investments in the Tidelands Trust. I think I like that. I don't see a reason to do more legal research to find out if they can leverage those for investments outside of the Tidelands Trust. So I think it's reasonable, and it seems to fit with legal standards to be able to invest within the Tidelands Trust area. In terms of more city control, I definitely agree that we want to have more city control. And I like the idea of aligning with the downtown and waterfront master plans. And then I also want to agree with hearing more about an audit. I'd like to hear what the plan could be for an audit. I understand there could be some expense with that, but I think it's an important piece of things. And finally, I want to thank Councilmember Davis for bringing up the chamber letter. I have said a number of times that I support looking at paid parking. And so I still support looking at paid parking. It doesn't mean I support paid parking, but I still am confounded as to why we continue to not even look at paid parking as an option. I like the idea of looking at the entire waterfront as a bid or a harbor district. And I think it's important to keep our chamber engaged in this process as we look for new ideas. Obviously, we need to think about the harbor in new and different ways. So I want to appreciate the group again and thank you for the incredible amount of time that it took to put all of this together. It's obvious how much expertise went into this, and I very much appreciate it.
Oops, there we go. Thank you so much for those comments, Councilmember Addis. I took notes extensively as you all were speaking and basically agree with all of the common themes. I'll try to just recount those very quickly for staff so that you can capture those thematically across the board. It's almost consistent and unanimous among all council members, including myself. The current model for funding the harbor is not sustainable and never will be sustainable if we only consider leasehold interest funds and or revenues as the only and primary source for capital and or operational improvements. And that was uniformly expressed by a number of council members. I personally do not support a bid. I would appreciate the opportunity to have the staff look at potential for a harbor district. I've aired that a number of times, but think that from a funding standpoint, that is going to be necessary for the future viability of this area. I also support the comments made with regard to refinancing. I think any refinancing associated with the approved asset on Tidelands Trust land should be utilized on a Tidelands Trust property, whether it's the existing lessee's property and or a new acquisition that the lessee would like to acquire. So I believe that there was uniform support for that. The other items that were mentioned had to do with the alignment of the long-term plan and vision for the waterfront and council remaining in control over the future vision. I absolutely agree with that and think that that needs to happen quickly to determine the future allocation of resources and also the mix of lease and lessees that we wish to see on the Embarcadero. I would support a look at parking revenues. I'm not convinced, as Councilmember Addis mentioned, that it would be viable, but I would support the evaluation. With the concept of fixed rate leases, I do not support that, even though the chamber has made that recommendation. I do believe that there would be significant revenue losses if we tried to move in that direction, or that fixed amount would have to be extremely significant to maintain the current revenue stream. I would support relooking, as Councilmember Davis mentioned, at our current assessment formulas. And there's a table, can't remember what page it's on, but I do believe that comparatively there's opportunity there for changing some of the formula amounts. I also support the comment that has to do with consistency as much as possible in uniformity or standardization of lease terms across the board. And let's see if I've missed any of the items here. Just going through my notes. I also support external contracting for lease management that has no reflection on the current harbor department or harbor director. I believe that that department is extremely stretched for resources and that there is a significant need to have a professional manager not only routinely evaluate the audits and both fiscal and physical, but also to negotiate the terms of the leases and manage the leases as well. And I think that was a uniform theme that came across with regard to everybody. Councilmember Heller suggested the possibility of volunteer groups being activated early on to make minor improvements. And I would certainly support that if we had the opportunity to have those groups come forward. So with that, I will ask Mr. Endersby and Mr. Collins if you have captured that and if that's enough detail for this item.
I've certainly captured. I've taken, well, excuse me, 4 or 5 pages of my own notes here. So I think you guys are all very uniform in your comments, which is great. Thank you for that. I don't have any other questions on your input overall. I appreciate the thoughtfulness on it all, and see if Scott has any comments on it, but we'll, after this meeting in the next week or so, we'll have to get together and start putting the next steps together and how we're going to move forward with this.
Yeah, thank you. Really good information and good exchange of ideas. I think one thing to note is that there were a lot of ideas, and with us dealing with the COVID and the financial crisis coming out of that, I think it'd be helpful for a prioritization of the many ideas that were shared today, so that the limited staff that we have available is applied to the most important 1 or 2 things that were identified today.
Thank you. That's certainly understandable. Vision, money, and management. That's my summary. With that, that ends this item. I also, again, can't thank the group enough. Mr. Lamelli, for your leadership, all of the members of the team that worked so diligently. Eric, you and your staff for the time that you spent. Mr. Collins, Ms. Calloway, appreciate all the time you have spent on this as well. And I want to thank the Chamber, GAC, Government Affairs Committee, for their extensive review and most interesting document. A lot of the comments that were made incorporated the ideas that you've provided, and we appreciate the analyses that you do. As Mr. Collins reminded me, I just am very happy with everything that's been done and everybody. Thank you very much for that. That ends this item. And Council, how you doing? Or can we move forward, or do you need a break for 2 minutes?
I'm good to continue.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep.
Keep going. Okay.
I'm good.
Sounds like we'll keep going. That brings us to item C-2, adoption of resolution number 43-20, approving the engineer's report and declaring the intent to levy the annual assessment for the North Point Natural Area Landscaping and Lighting Maintenance Assessment District. Mr. Leivick, I believe, or Ms. Calloway.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Rob Leivick, City Engineer here, giving a brief presentation on the North Point Assessment District. As everybody knows, this is the second step in the process to levy the assessments for our assessment districts. This assessment district has been with us since 1997. It was as condition of approval when the city approved Tract 2110, the North Point subdivision. and it is funded by the 10 property owners, paying a total of a fixed $5,600 annual assessment. The assessment district takes care of the open space area and the parking lot, along with some fixed improvements such as bike rack, benches, signs, the street lighting, trash cans, stairs, path system, and maintenance of that parking lot. In fiscal year 1920, personnel costs came in at about $5,300, utilities $1,700, payment of the assessment district share of the city's cost allocation plan, approximately $300, for a total of about $7,482 of the $5,600 available. This is due to, we believe, and still doing some research on this, a double counting in the staff time for the time records. There's should be an automatic recording of staff time, and we're going through the time records to see if that got overridden inadvertently, and we'll make that correction. For this coming fiscal year, 2021, we're proposing $2,600 in staff time, $800 in utilities, $704 in the cost allocation plan, and about $1,500 in supplies, totaling $5,644.91, leaving 9 cents to spare. There is no fund balance in the accumulation fund. That is because of a major capital expenditure a few years ago where the city and contract services rebuilt the stairs. In fact, we believe that some of that money was borrowed from the storm drain assessment district #1. And again, this is another area we're investigating to do some research on to determine that final accumulation balance. What we're recommending the city do is adopt Resolution 4320, declaring the intent to levy the annual assessment for the maintenance of the North Point open space area and approve the engineer's report at this meeting. The proposed assessment will be $5,645 for the 10 lots, or $564.50 for each assessable parcel for fiscal year 2021. The proposed public hearing to impose the levy would be at the regular city council meeting on June 23rd. That concludes my staff report, and answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Liebig. Appreciate that. Council, any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Councilmember Heller.
So Rob, I like that North Point area. That's where I go to watch for whales, sit on that bench out there. Haven't seen a whale yet, but I still enjoy that spot. But I was wondering, $5,600 isn't a lot of money. You get complaints from the homeowners out there? Are they okay with the space the way it's maintained, or what are your thoughts about that?
So this was established as a fixed assessment with no CPI adjustment, and it would need to go to a Prop 218 vote to increase that assessment. So we have 50.
I'm not suggesting it be increased. That will go on the records. I'm just wondering, in general, I mean, are the folks out there happy with it? That's all I'm asking. I'm not suggesting an increase. No.
I think they're happy with the level of maintenance that we've been able to maintain out there. They would like some more lighting in the parking lot because there are activities that occur there after dark that they don't necessarily appreciate. So we've been trying to figure out a way to fund lighting, and perhaps that can be incorporated when the Cayucas-Morro Bay connector goes through that area, and there will need to be some improvements with those facilities, and we may be able to add another street light to that end of that parking lot area.
Okay. Thanks for your frankness. I appreciate it. That's my only question.
Perhaps the activity they don't like is that whale watcher guy that's out there. Any other questions?
Well, I would just like to say that I did have a couple questions, but I asked Mr. Livick them in advance, and he was kind enough to send me responses. And mostly it had to do with the numbers. I was concerned because obviously it appeared that the fund balance was being spent down, and he has confirmed that in his presentation. So my concern now is that he needs to, carefully monitor this coming year expenses on the project. So that's it, but thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? If not, I will open up public comment. Any member of the public wishing to comment on item C2? Zeke, do we have anybody in the queue?
There's one person in the queue, but their hand is not up.
Okay. So I'll wait for a hand. If you do want to comment, public comment on item C2, please raise your hand. Seeing no raised hands, I will bring it back to council and entertain a motion.
I move that we adopt resolution number 43-20, approving the engineer's report and declaring the intent to levy the annual assessment for the North Point Natural Area Landscaping and Lighting Maintenance Assessment District.
I'll second.
So that's a motion by Councilmember McPherson for the recommendation by staff, second by Councilmember Heller. Any further discussion? Hearing none, roll call vote, please.
Councilmember McPherson?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
And thank you, Mr. Livick, for that presentation. That brings us to item number C-3, adoption of resolution number 44-20. Approving the engineer's report and declaring the intent to levy the annual assessment for the Cloisters Landscaping and Lighting Maintenance Assessment District. Turn it over to Mr. Livick again. Thank you.
Very similar report on this. This assessment district has been with us since 1996. This assessment district was also required as through the approval process for this development. It includes a public park, bicycle pathways, right-of-way landscaping, coastal access ways, ash restoration areas, scenic conservation easement, passive recreation, and coastal access. None of which may be developed with any improvement or structures. The Cloisters Assessment District is funded by the 122 property owners out there paying towards the annual $148,944 annual assessment. And these funds can only be used to fund items within the Landscape Lighting Maintenance Assessment District. This question came up at our community meeting that was held last week. There was concern that with budgetary issues that it might not be wise to spend any of the Cloisters money, but this is really the only spot that these funds can be spent in. It also is the maintenance work is provided by city staff, so it is a way to keep that staff work busy. We have a capital project that'll be completing this year that council approved in the mid-year budget report that will purchase the landscape materials, and the landscape materials will be installed by staff. This assessment district, as I said, takes care of parkland, open space, a wetland area, medians and parkways, and within the public right-of-way. There's hardscape that we need to take care of, benches, barbecues, bike racks, signage, drinking fountains, and the like. Expenditures for this year, year to date, as of March 3rd, personnel costs, almost $72,000, utilities, $29,000, with $25,000 of that being for water, $5,000 towards the cost allocation plan, services and supplies, about $20,000, total expenditure, $125,009 of the $165,000 approved. That includes that capital project. The revenues that we've received for the district are $99,000 of the assessment district funds, and will receive have received the remaining in the second tax payment. We're ending the accumulation fund balance with fiscal year 2019-20, unaudited, of course, with about almost $210,000. For this coming fiscal year, we're proposing to spend $93,000 in personnel, $34,000 in utilities, $11,000 to the cost allocation plan, $10,000 to services and supplies, $148,800, almost the entire assessment. So I said we'll end the accumulation fund this year with about $210,000. Once we complete the first phase of the landscaping project that was approved by council this year, we'll begin next year with about $155,000 in the accumulation fund, and then we'll program that to carry on with those landscaping improvements. Like I said, capital projects that we've completed are the conceptual design report, and we'll be finishing the first phase of the landscaping rehab work, and we're starting with the entrance median. Future capital projects will be continue with the landscaping overhaul. Median is the first priority. We'll need to look at replacing the play structure in the park, and we're getting refinements on those costs. And then a big concern for the community is the wetlands area and the pond. It is becoming overgrown with reeds. We've cut them several times now, and unfortunately, by just cutting them, they keep coming back. Working with the San Luis biologist, he recommending a dredging project, which will be a large permitting undertaking. We'll need to get, because it's working within the waters of the U.S., we'll need to get the Army Corps involved, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the California Fish and Wildlife involved in the permitting of that. So it may be a ways out before we actually be able to dredge that pond. So what we're looking for council to do is approve resolution 44-20, declaring the intent to levy the annual assessment for the Cloisters Park Landscape Lighting Assessment District, and then to set the public hearing for June 23rd, 2020. That concludes my report, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. I'll open it up for any council questions. Any questions, council? Hearing none, I'll go ahead and open public comment. This is public comment for item C-3. Any member of the public wishing to comment on this item, please do so now. Zeke, anybody in the queue?
Just one person in the queue, and the hand's not up.
Okay, I'll wait a second. If you're in the queue and you'd like to speak on this item, Dana, perhaps we could put up the rules for getting the hand up at *9 if you've called in, and or using the link on the agenda to get into the Zoom website. Thank you. So no hand, Zeke?
No, but I can go ahead and unmute them so that we can ask them if they'd like to speak.
That'd be fine.
Okay, I'll do that.
Are you waiting to speak on item C-3?
It doesn't seem to be working. I'm wondering, okay, they just left, that's why.
Okay. Well, I will close public comment, bring it back to council for the entertaining of a motion.
Before we do a motion, I just want to say what a great job Rob's crew is doing out there. Gail and I ride our bikes through the cloisters every day, and it is obvious that it is a magnet for people who are looking for a sanctuary of peace and natural greenery and a place to kind of do some exercise and actually do some socializing at a distance. So just, Rob, thank you for all the work that your crew does. It's a great place to be.
I'll pass that along to Clem and JR and the gang.
Thank you. I'll entertain a motion.
I move we adopt resolution number 44-20, approving the engineer's report and declaring the intent to levy the annual assessment for the Cloisters Landscaping and Lighting Maintenance Assessment District.
I'll second.
Motion by Councilmember McPherson for the staff recommendation, seconded by Councilmember Addis. And I will add a further comment to echo what Councilmember Davis said. I do get my bike riding out there occasionally, and I still don't believe you're able to do, or the group is able to do all the work they do without a CPI accelerator over all these years and maintain the cloisters in such nice shape. So thank you for that. Any other comments?
I just want to echo that. I know our family has been doing a lot of walking lately, and the Cloisters is one of our favorite places to connect North Morro Bay and to get to walk through. And I just think it's one of the gems of our community, and I very much appreciate the care that's given.
Thank you. Okay, roll call vote, please.
Councilmember McPherson?
Yes.
Councilmember Addis?
Yes.
Councilmember Davis?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
And Mayor Heading?
Yes.
Motion carries
Thank you.
5-0.
Great, thank you. And that brings us to item D, council declaration of future agenda items. Anybody?
I don't have an agenda item per se, but I do have a question about if something will be addressed at our special meeting. And so
Sure.
We've been contacted by a few residents about masks and mask wearing, and will the city do more about mask wearing? I know a couple of cities have considered ordinances to require people to wear masks in certain situations. I know there's been a white paper by the county health officer, and today I believe the Tribune put out an op-ed saying that if the county isn't going to require people to wear masks, that cities should require people to wear masks. And so I'm wondering if the issue of masks, I know the agenda is not out yet for the special meeting, but I just would like to request that the issue of masks be specifically addressed at that special city council meeting, or if my colleagues would consider getting it on a future agenda item if it's not yet planned for that special meeting.
Thank you for that. And I'm considering this to be part of a request for a future agenda item. If it were not to be included, and it will be included as part of the discussion on Thursday's special meeting. Thank you very much for bringing that up. I've had the same concerns, seen the same concerns, and plan to bring the information forward and have discussion on that. So thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
Mr. Mayor, I have one.
Yes, sir.
If you think it's appropriate. There's been a lot of talk tonight about some kind of a district, perhaps for the harbor or the Embarcadero. Is that something we could agendize for a future meeting, or is it going to be discussed in a future meeting in the near term, or what's the best way to handle that?
Yeah, I would support that.
Okay, I'd like to see that agendized, that specific item.
Do we have other support for?
Quick on that.
Yes.
Yeah, happy to do that. I just want to let folks know we did do survey in October, November of last year that looked at a number of things, including potential measures to support general fund and harbor, and I can circulate that amongst council members. It was back on our website a long while ago, but there didn't appear to be much community support for such a thing. But I mean, certainly can bring it back. But that was something that council specifically had us look at over a year ago. But we can bring it back if that's something council would like us to do.
Thanks, Scott. And I knew that. And I also know that we have a tremendous number of items on the future agendas to consider. So it may be a while before it gets there, but it would be nice to have it for future consideration, I think. At least I would support it.
Can I weigh in?
Sure, you can. Absolutely.
I would actually prefer that it somehow be part of the budget discussion and in terms of how we're going to be funding the harbor department moving forward. And I think that certainly in that discussion would be some suggestions about whether or not we should be looking at that as, I would like the staff to perhaps address it that way, if just because of the volume of issues that we have that we've been postponing and putting off. And I just know our agenda is very heavy. So that's my suggestion.
So the issue, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So Councilmember McPherson, I have no problem with that. I just don't want it to fall between the cracks. And my memory is good for, on a good day, about 6 months. So I'd forgotten that this was actually addressed a year ago. So please forgive me on that. But I think it's a key component of what we talked about tonight. But if we want to talk about it when we talk about funding the budget, I'm totally good with that.
And I would be fine with that as well. So
I would support that. Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, I was just saying we can figure out, Eric and I can figure out how to get that in a narrative format somehow in the budget discussions.
Great.
And
Jim, I think if we want that to happen, we need to start building support for it, regardless of what the survey said a year ago. We need to really look at that. So that's all.
And I think, Dawn, you supported it. Did I hear you say?
Yes, and I was going to also say, speaking of memories, it reminded me that 3 of us said that we would be interested in taking a look at paid parking. And I wonder if that can come forward either as part of the budget discussion or as a future agenda item. I know we've circled around it numerous times. I don't think the information has changed. I think it's really about council deciding if we've changed our perspective or not.
Yeah, and I think there's always been support for discussing it. It's just a matter of, doing a proper study requires the dreaded word consultant to do it right, especially if you're going to get it approved by the Coastal Commission, which oversees parking regulations, particularly, in our area that we don't have paid parking. So it would be a very significant effort. And so, I know we keep talking about it and bringing it back, but we really would need to invest to do it properly. And that's, so we, if that's a direction that council wants to go in, then we need to actually appropriate funds to do a study.
I don't recall, you probably brought it forward, and I know we're not discussing it at the moment. I don't recall what the costs are. And so I guess my request would be, as part of the budget discussion, then could we look at the costs, or as part of a future agenda item, could we look at the cost for a consultant? I know that a couple times that it's come forward before, it's come forward as asking a couple companies if they would do the study for free, with the idea that maybe we would hire them for other services later on. I don't recall and maybe you did bring the cost forward before.
No, we have not. Yeah. So again, if that's something council wants us to do, I don't know if I'll have ability to say definitively what that would cost by May 26th, which is the first budget hearing. But again, if this is something the majority of council wants us to do, we can do it. I just need to be able to give you a realistic check, because it's either me or Scott Graham that would be doing that, even that work in terms of determining what the cost would be. And quite frankly, I don't have the time for that right now. And I don't think Scott does either.
Thanks for the comments. My sense is that it would be unfair to lay on staff the requirement to bring this for the 26th. However, we can put it on the future agenda list, which it may be far out there, but at least we've got it as a place mark to consider sometime in the future when we have more time to do that.
With a little, I guess my request would be then with a little more specificity. Sure. With as a future agenda item where we could actually look at the cost of a consultant then and sort of assess where we're at that point in time in the future. If Pismo is reporting close to $500,000 for their paid parking program that they're receiving, I think it behooves us to know what it would cost for a consultant to give us the information.
Thank you. I agree with that. Okay. So we've agreed we'll put it on as a future agenda item with a little more specificity and bring that back.
I would support that.
Okay. Very good. All right. That ends this meeting. I will adjourn the meeting. The next special meeting of the Morro Bay City Council will be on Thursday, 5/14/20, this coming Thursday at 2 p.m., a special discussion on COVID-19. The next regular meeting of the Morro Bay City Council will be held on Tuesday, May 26, 2020 at 5:30 p.m. and both meetings will be via teleconference. Thank you all. Good evening. Be safe and be well.